Chapter 38:53. But Wen Yuan was everyone's surprise. Bai Shuili took a sip of the iced beer. It felt good, but she only dared to drink a small glass. She lowered her eyes and said softly, "Old Bai, I used to secretly envy Wen Yuan. She did what I couldn't do in the past. You see, I chased after you shamelessly for so long, but I didn't get anything. Wen Yuan was different. She got together with you, and she was so amazing in my heart. But then she was lying on the hospital bed, and her child was almost gone. I was wondering if Wen Yuan wasn't amazing anymore, or if it was because you didn't love her, so she didn't want to love you anymore." Yimu Bai smiled faintly. "Who knows? You clearly know what she's thinking and doing now. It's a good thing that she's learning how to arrange flowers and how to make tea, but she's not in your world anymore, old Bai." Bai Shuili emphasized. "Aren't you worried at all?" Yimu Bai stared into her eyes and smiled bitterly. "Shueli, is there any use for me to be worried? I treat her well, and I almost don't go out, but—" He rubbed his good-looking chin and lowered his voice. "But she still wants to leave." Yes, she wanted to leave. He could tell that her heart wasn't with him, or with Kong Xiao, or with her other dreams. It wouldn't be with him, Yimu Bai. After he finished speaking, he took a deep puff of his cigarette and drank a glass of iced beer. It felt good after drinking it, and it didn't burn up. He closed his eyes gently. "Shueli, I don't know how to treat her. I'm afraid that she'll leave even if I use up all my strength. You can make her stay." Bai Shueli reached out and knocked his head. "You're not like the little Bai know-it-all. You're the Yimu Bai that she's been infatuated with for many years. Wen Yuan is just temporary. Believe me, she cares about you." Yimu Bai leaned against the back of the chair and murmured, "Cares." He let out a long sigh. When he raised his head, the corners of his eyes felt warm. It was an indescribable and complicated feeling. Bai Shuili stared at him. She realized that Lao Bai had changed. In the past, Lao Bai wasn't like this. He was very, very Buddhist. Even when it came to Cece, he would let her go easily. There was only one possibility for him to change, and that was, she asked softly, "Lao Bai, have you ever thought that you might like Wen Yuan very, very much? Or have you fallen in love with her? Only when you love someone will you feel the pain of not being able to get what you want." Lao Bai's current state was exactly that. Yimu Bai stared at her for a long time before he let out a long sigh. "Perhaps. It's good that you admit it. Wen Yuan is still your wife. You should get her back. You still have 2 children, Bai Shuili said softly, encouraging him. Yimu Bai pursed his lips and smiled faintly. Later, he got up and said, "I'll send you back to the hotel." She didn't stay in the apartment mainly because it was inconvenient. She had chased after Lao Bai for 18 streets in the past. Bai Shuili saw that it was getting late. She nodded and took her bag for him to send to the hotel. When Yimu Bai returned to the apartment from the hotel, it was already 10 o'clock at night. Because Bai Shuili was there, when Yuan's tea art class was moved to later. He was still in class at 10 o'clock. He threw his car keys down and looked at her. Still in class. When Yuan was making tea with a young female teacher. The female teacher was also Chinese. She wasn't even 30 years old. She was very pretty and wore a long white dress. Her black hair was long and straight, and she had a classical beauty. End of chapter. Chapter 38:54. Yimu Bai was a director. He took a second look, but didn't say anything. He changed his shoes, leaned over, and kissed Wen Yuan's forehead. "Don't stay up too late. I'm going to take a shower first." Wen Yuan didn't resist his intimacy. She was willing to save him some face in front of outsiders, so she smiled and watched him enter the bedroom. He didn't say hello to the young teacher, because it was unnecessary. But the female teacher looked at his back and asked Wen Yuan casually, "Mrs. Yi, you and Mr. Yi seem to have a good relationship." Wen Yuan smiled. It's not that bad. She didn't want to talk about Yimu Bai, so she changed the topic. "Ms. Song, try this." Song Yu came back to her senses and tasted it. "It's very good." But her eyes drifted to the direction of the master bedroom. Wen Yuan just looked at her quietly and didn't say anything. In Song Yu's eyes, a super mansion of 600 square meters on Jinghua Road, a handsome man, a pregnant wife, and the fact that she could come over at any time were all opportunities for her. Song Yu was a 28-year-old girl. She had been in love twice, but her partners were always hardworking men like her. They couldn't give her the life she wanted. With such men, even if she wore beautiful clothes, she couldn't live in a place that was less than 20 square meters when she got home. That wasn't the life she wanted to live. She was young, beautiful, and virtuous. She didn't want to go to those places. Now, Bai had given her a lot of space to fantasize, and she couldn't wait to have him. In the next few days, Bai found that he met Miss Song more often. When he came back from the opposite office to visit Wen Yuan, he would always see Song Yu at their house. Later, he asked the servants at home, "Why does the tea art teacher always come? Isn't there only 1.5 hours of tea art class every day?" The servant thought for a while and said, "Miss Song seems to come a little more these days, but she said that she and Mrs. Yi are very good friends." She paused. "Sir, as servants, it's not good for us to interfere with Mrs. Ye's affairs." Bai didn't say anything and went to the study. He took some documents and was going to go back to the studio, but now he didn't plan to go back. He just read in the study. After watching for a long time, a strange voice sounded at the door. "Mr. Yi, do you need a cup of tea?" Bai looked up at Song Yu quietly. "Where's my wife?" He was a little unhappy because he didn't like people entering his study, let alone a stranger. Song Yu was still dressed in white today. She wore an off-shoulder knitted shirt and a tulle skirt. She was beautiful and intellectual. She was a woman who was good at dressing up and managing herself. She would live the life she wanted. She knew that men in the upper class needed to know themselves, just like Mr. Yi. Their relationship seems to be good, but she finds it is not good after a long time. She dares to bet that Mr. Yi is a man who hasn't had sex for a long time. The relationship between a man and a woman can be seen from their body language. She sees him kissing his wife for the first time. Although Wen Yuan doesn't push him away, his body is very stiff. All of this gave Song Yu an excuse. She told herself that it wasn't wrong for her to get close to Bai. This was a man who couldn't get his wife's warmth. She just gave him a little warmth, and then she got what she wanted. It was just taking what she needed. In a chapter. Chapter 3855. At this time, Bai asks. Song Yu smiles. When Yuan said he was a little sleepy and wanted to sleep for a while. I thought it would be a pity to leave the tea we made, so I wanted to bring it to Mr. Yi to have a taste. She always knows when to advance and when to retreat. She doesn't come in at once, but just stands at the door. What kind of man is Bai? The women who used to chase after him are lined up from here to France. Song Yu is just a woman. This kind of stupid pickup makes him disgusted. Not to mention that he has a wife and a son now. Wen Yuan is her student. He spent a lot of money to invite her to teach him, but the woman in front of him just wants to climb into his bed. Is Wen Yuan so stupid? But he knows clearly that Wen Yuan is not so stupid. She can see it, but he lets such a woman stay in their house. What does Wen Yuan want to do? Bai squints his eyes and says lightly, "I don't like tea." "Thank you, Miss Song." Song Yu is a little embarrassed. She doesn't expect that he would be so unreasonable. He is usually a very gentle person, but she is not reconciled. She still wants to have a try. So she smiles lightly. "Mr. Yi, do you like coffee or something else? Shall I make it for you?" Bai says very lightly, "I don't need it. Besides, you are the tea art teacher invited by Wen Yuan. You should focus on teaching instead of paying too much attention to her husband." Song Yu is a little embarrassed, standing at the door. He pauses. "You are fired." Song Yu's face is full of disbelief. Her lips tremble slightly. "Why? Don't you know why?" He says very lightly, "Miss Song, if there is nothing else, you can leave now." Song Yu's expression seems to be insulted. She bites her lips and stares at Bai. "Mr. Yi, I don't know what I did wrong." Bai gets up and walks to her slowly. He looks at her condescendingly, and his voice is very low. "Since I was 20 years old, there have been many women chasing me. I won't blame them. But now I have a wife. Miss Song, I admire your 3 views. Do you think I will still let you stay in my house?" He said it so bluntly that Song Yu couldn't deny it. She bit her lip and wanted to leave, but when she moved her eyes, she saw Wen Yuan standing at the door of the bedroom, looking at them. Song Yu quickly rushed forward and hugged Bai tightly, as if she was staking everything in one throw. Ever since she was young, there had been countless men who had feelings for her, But there had never been a man who treated her like this, completely without mercy. Even if she couldn't have him, she didn't want to let him have it easy. He was too hateful. Yi Mubai frowned and immediately saw Wen Yuan opposite him. Wen Yuan's face seemed to be slightly hurt. He immediately pushed Song Yu away and raised his voice. "Take this woman away." Song Yu bumped into the opposite door in embarrassment. At this time, the family servants ran over and guessed what had happened. They immediately dragged Song Yu aside and said, "Miss Song, how could you do such a thing? Madam is so good to you." Song Yu still couldn't come back to her senses. After a while, she came back to her senses. She was a little absent-minded, and then she chuckled softly. "Okay, yes, it's really good." She had been tricked. From the beginning to the end, she was just a chess piece. Wen Yuan had always known what she was thinking, but he had never said it. He let Song Yu come over and watch her make a fool of herself and be amorous, while Wen Yuan, who was holding his 6-month-old belly, watched coldly from the side. End of this chapter. Chapter 38:56. Song Yu left. Before she left, she raised her head arrogantly. Her behavior and actions fully explained one thing, which was that she had a lofty heart and a fragile life. She thought that Wen Yuan was a fool, but in Wen Yuan's eyes, she was nothing at all. After Song Yu left, the servants also left, anticipating that there would be a big fight at home. It was obvious that the male host and the female host didn't get along very well. Usually it was fine, but today, because of Miss Song's matter, they were probably going to have a big fight. The house of a few hundred square meters was so quiet that one could hear a pin drop. Yi Mubai walked over slowly, grabbed Wen Yuan's hand, and dragged her into the study. The door was closed gently, and he suppressed his voice. "Why did you do that?" Wen Yuan held his stomach, walked to the sofa, and sat down. "I don't know what you're talking about. You deliberately allowed Song Yu to get close to me and seduce me." "Wen Yuan, what do you want to see?" He leaned forward and held the back of the sofa with one hand to get close to her. "Do you want to see a pornographic scene between me and her?" As he said that, he pinched her chin with one hand and said with an ugly expression on his face, "Am I such a lousy man? In your heart, as long as a woman who looks decent gets close to you and seduces you, I will be so hungry that I will not be picky, am I right?" "I didn't say that." She was forced to look up and meet his gaze. Under the dim yellow light, Yi Mubai's gaze was unfathomable as he stared into her eyes. There was a storm in his eyes, and there was a touch of heartache. He said slowly, "But you did it." He pulled her into his arms gently and brought her to the bathroom without being too rude. Wen Yuan didn't doubt that if she hadn't been pregnant today, she would have been killed by him. He dragged her to the sink, hugged her from behind, and trapped her, forcing her to look into the mirror. His voice was unbelievably hoarse. "Tell me, what do you think? Catch us cheating and then negotiate the terms and divorce after giving birth to the child, right?" Wen Yuan looked at him in the mirror and smiled. "Yi Mubai, do you think I need to use Song Yu if I want a divorce? I just don't care about it. And I don't care what happens between you and others, so everything happens naturally. It doesn't matter to me whether you accept it or not. It doesn't matter." He muttered these words and then laughed softly. "Yes, Wen Yuan, it doesn't matter anymore. You don't love me anymore, do you?" "Yes." She stared into his eyes and said without hesitation. It was a provocation and a declaration. Yi Mubai's mind went blank for a moment. He asked, but he didn't expect her to say it so straightforwardly. The air froze for a moment. After a long time, Yi Mubai's gaze softened. It was no longer as fierce as before. Instead, there was a hint of warmth in his calm eyes. His hands tightened slowly, and then he was holding her, hugging her gently from behind, his face buried in her hair, her neck, his expression vulnerable. "Sorry, Wen Yuan." His lips were pressed against her artery, so his voice was muffled. "I'm sorry. I won't be mean to you anymore. In the future, I will never ask you to love me. I love you, that's all." He closed his eyes and held her tightly. He hugged her and imagined that he could see the little stars in her eyes when he looked up. He imagined that she still loved him. Please remember the domain name of this book. Jiuqian Shenwang. Chapter 38:57. But that was just his imagination, his imagination. Her love for him ended when he left. Yimubai hugged her. He hugged her like that for a long time, as though he was going to hold her until the end of time. Wen Yuan didn't struggle and let him hug her. Finally, he murmured, "Don't let her come again. I won't like her, and I won't like anyone else." Wen Yuan smiled faintly. Yes, he wouldn't like anyone else, including Wen Yuan. He only liked Lin Cece. She didn't talk to him, and she didn't respond to his words. Yimu Bai was frustrated. He still let go of her and slowly stepped back. His voice was hoarse. "You should rest." Wen Yuan turned to the side and paused for a moment before saying softly, "Yimu Bai, some things are in the past. I don't want to force myself, so don't force me, okay?" Her voice was even lower. "I just want to give birth to the child now." And then, he stood at the door and clenched his hands. "Wen Yuan, I shouldn't have asked, but I still asked. I'm not someone who can't control his emotions. Do you know what this means?" After he finished speaking, he was a little nervous and slowly turned his head. Wen Yuan shook her head and leaned against the sink. She lowered her gaze and refused to meet his eyes. "I don't care anymore, Yimu Bai. Loving someone is tiring. After exhausting all my energy, I'm really, really tired," he said. "I can love you." Wen Yuan just shook his head and smiled lightly. She held her stomach and walked out, walking past him. Yimu Bai immediately grabbed her hand. He didn't say anything and just grabbed her hand. There were too many thoughts hidden in such an action. Wen Yuan still broke free and slowly left the study, as though she was leaving his world. Yimu Bai closed his eyes and clenched his fists tightly. The days continued, cold and indifferent. If it was an ordinary couple, there was nothing wrong with living like this. Most couples should live like this. But Yimu Bai was not satisfied. He was not satisfied with this kind of life. He wanted her to love him, and he also wanted to love her. She didn't give him a chance. As always, he insisted on sleeping in the same bed with her. Sometimes he couldn't help but take her hand and hold her in his arms like before. Wen Yuan had been passive, letting him do whatever he wanted. As long as it didn't affect the child in her stomach, she didn't seem to care. He was disappointed, but he couldn't find a way out. Once on the way back, he was a little distracted while driving, and his car rear-ended the car in front of him. After the crash, cold sweat broke out on his back, and he sat in the car for a long time without coming back to his senses. At that time, he wondered how Wen Yuan would feel if he died, and Wen Yuan still hadn't forgiven him. Then, he lowered his eyes and smiled bitterly. He probably didn't feel anything. There had always been a knot between him and her, and that was Lin Cece. She didn't mention it, and he didn't mention it either. It was like a thorn in her heart. She didn't want to pull it out because she had lost hope in him. Yimu Bai suddenly leaned on the steering wheel and didn't get up for a long time. Just then, the car door opened, and a slightly fierce face appeared. He used vulgar English to hurl insults and racial slurs. Yimu Bai slowly looked up, and his eyes were bloodshot. Then, he unbuttoned his seatbelt, then his jacket, and finally unbuttoned his shirt. He rolled his sleeves up to his elbows and got out of the car. Please remember the domain name of this book. Come, wonderful book house. Come. Chapter 3858. The Caucasian man thought that Yi Chun was an Asian man who could be bullied easily, but Yi Chun was more than 180 centimeters tall, and his eyes were full of hostility. The Caucasian man's legs trembled, and he almost peed his pants. Before he could beg, Yimu Bai punched him and broke the Caucasian man's nose. Blood and tears flew everywhere. But this was far from enough. Yimu Bai punched and kicked him until he was half dead. Get up and fight back. Are you still going to call yourself the sick man of East Asia? Huh? The Caucasian man lay on the ground in a terrible state, clutching his ribs. Shen Yin, lunatic. He must have met a lunatic. He shouted in English. I'm going to put you in jail. Just you wait. You're finished, you damn Asian man. What awaited him was another round of punches and kicks. He was beaten until he was half disabled. Of course, Yimu Bai was also taken to the police station and locked up. No one knew who leaked the news, but it was all over the news. After all, he was a famous director, and he was once a best actor. After half a day, the incident had escalated beyond recognition. The public relations department of his film company was busy with public relations. while Su Mo went to see Yi Mu Bai first. Everyone was convinced by Yi Mu Bai's actions. They really hadn't seen anyone who didn't care about their reputation more than him. They could have just chased after someone and settled it privately. Why did he have to beat them until they were half dead? Great, of course. Su Mo couldn't blame her boss. She just communicated with him about the situation, such as whether to hire a local lawyer or a lawyer from New York. Call my brother. He's familiar with this area, Yi Mu Bai said calmly. Su Mo, after a while, she nodded. Okay, I'll contact him. Also, this matter is written in the newspaper. Wen Yuan should have seen it. Director Yi, do you want to see him? Yi Mu Bai looked at Su Mo and suddenly asked, does he want to see me? Su Mo couldn't answer this question. Yi Mu Bai smiled faintly and then said, I don't think he wants to see me either. Let's leave it at that. He let out a long sigh. Let's leave it at that. Ask the lawyer to bail me out as soon as possible. Su Mo thought to himself, I thought you didn't want to go out. In the end, after Yi Mulin received the call, he flew into a rage at his house in B City and threw his cup. His temper was similar to Yi Jinggong's. Bai Shuili didn't say anything. Although she didn't know much about these things, she knew how serious the matter was when she saw Yi Mulin's anger. Yi Mulin vented his anger and then said in a cold voice, he's doing this for Wen Yuan to see. Wen Yuan ignored him and he did this. Isn't it ridiculous for a man in his 30s? Bai Shuili said softly. Xiao Bai is just trying to save an old horse. Cure my ass. Yi Mulin immediately cursed. He's crazy. Do you know how many years you'll be sentenced to in America? His family's riceworm looked at him eagerly. More than 3 years. Yi Mulin took out a cigarette and put it in his mouth. Before he could light it up, he couldn't help but put it down. If that person is disabled, he'll be waiting to spend the rest of his life in jail. After saying that, he started to smoke. Bai Shuili tugged at his sleeve. He glared at her. He was in a bad mood and even wanted to be fierce to her. Riceworm tugged at him again. What are you doing? He was in a bad mood and threw her face. However, Bai Shuili was a thick-skinned person. She tugged at him again, and her voice was like a little lamb. Yi Mulin. Chapter 38:59. He was still looking at her as he lit a cigarette and took a puff. Bai Shuili immediately massaged his back and flattered him like a bee. Hubby is the best. He enjoyed it but snorted coldly. Don't even think about it. What kind of taste do you have? Back then, you followed Mu Bai's ass for so many years. Your eyes are practically blind. And Wen Yuan too. How bad must his taste be to like Mu Bai? Look at how childish he is. Bai Shuili felt that she was doing everything for the harmony of the family. But why was she the one being attacked now? She was innocent. Thus, she said unhappily, Xiao Bai is Wen Yuan's man now. Go talk to your ex-wife if you have the ability. What ex-wife? He pulled her out from behind and hugged her in his arms, knocking her head. The cigarette in his hand accidentally touched her hair. There was a burning smell. Bai Shuili shrieked, and he panicked too. He put out the cigarette in a flurry and looked at her. She glared at him. You're so mean to me, and you even burn my hair. Yi Mulin smiled helplessly. All right. It's a matter between them. Why are we getting angry here? Mulin. Her expression softened, and she reached out to hold his hand. Her expression was as soft as a small animal. Although it's their matter, can you think of a way? When I went to see them last time, Wen Yuan was fine, but Old Bai wasn't good at all. It was as if he was going crazy. Her voice was soft, lovesickness. You know. Yi Mulin looked at her in annoyance and amusement. She hugged him and said coquettishly, think about it. One is your brother, and the other is your ex-wife. If you don't help them, who will? Bai Shuili, try calling me ex-wife. You're my ex-wife. He knocked her little head. She smiled foolishly, and he couldn't do anything about it. He smoked for a while more and called Secretary Li to ask about his schedule. He then asked Secretary Li to spare 3 days, and he had to fly immediately. Actually, with his identity, he couldn't leave the country at will. However, Mu Bai's matter was not a small matter, and he couldn't rest assured if he didn't make a trip. Bai Shuili hugged him and kissed him when she saw how resolute he was. I'm going to pack my luggage. Yi Mulin reached out to stop her. He didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Surely, we're going to deal with something. Do you think it's a holiday? She blinked. If you go, Mubai will be fine. He was stunned for a moment, then he smiled. Without saying anything, he dragged her over and held her in his arms. He kissed it and pressed it against his chest. Bai Shuili obediently let him hug her, not moving at all. Then, she quietly reached out and hugged his waist. Her voice was very soft. Yi Mulin, do you love me very much? Fool! His voice was hot. Do you love me very, very much? She asked again. This time, he knocked her little head. Go pack your luggage. She howled and jumped away. Yi Mulin looked at her and smiled. Then, he lit another cigarette. After all, this matter was a little big. He really wanted to open Mubai's head and ask him what he was thinking. He wasn't impulsive, but he did something impulsive. He knew that he did it because of Wen Yuan. He wanted Wen Yuan to care and break Wen Yuan's indifference. He could even use his own method to settle it. However, he still let the matter fester. Please remember the domain name of this book. .com. Wonderful Book House. Chapter 3860. Yi Mulin felt that it was serious because he realized how important Wen Yuan was in Mubai's heart. But Wen Yuan no longer loved Mubai. Yi Mulin and Bai Shuili flew to New York overnight, but it didn't bring her, leaving her with Su Fu. When they arrived in New York, it was snowing in the early morning. They went to Wen Yuan's apartment. She was there, and so was Su Mo. At that moment, Wen Yuan stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling window in the living room, looking at the gentle snow outside. She didn't make a sound. Bai Shuili called her Wen Yuan. Wen Yuan turned around and looked at them quietly. Then she smiled. You're here. She wasn't a fool. She knew why Yi Mubai was being so impulsive. Was it to make it impossible for her to live indifferently? He wanted to force out a reaction. He wanted to see what kind of reaction she would have. Wen Yuan didn't know what she should do. She should play the role of a virtuous wife and think of a way to get him out. She felt that it was ridiculous. Wasn't he being a little too willful? Yi Mulin's arrival made things much simpler. His connections in the American legal system were terrifying, and he had many unknown methods. Yi Mulin stayed in the apartment for a while and went to see Yi Mubai's lawyer. This was Yi Mulin's schoolmate in the United States, and he was the best lawyer in the United States. When he went out, Wen Yuan and Bai Shuili were still in the apartment. Bai Shuili endured the sleepiness and didn't go to deal with the jet lag. She kept Wen Yuan and Xiangnan company. Xiangnan was such a good child. Bai Shuili thought that he was much better than an nun. In the afternoon, when Yi Mulin came back, he came back with Yi Mubai. The brothers got out of the elevator, but didn't go back to the apartment first. Instead, they sat by the window and smoked together. Yi Mulin suppressed the fire in his heart and puffed out a smoke ring. Mubai, this isn't your style. Yi Mubai lowered his head and lit his cigarette. He took a puff and looked into the distance. He smiled. Stupid, isn't it? I don't even know when she will leave me. She doesn't want me to accompany her or take care of her. We live together and sleep in the same bed every night, but we are no different from strangers. I'm not satisfied. This is the first time I'm so dissatisfied. It's your own fault for not being satisfied. Mubai, I know that you liked Lin Cece in the past, but Wen Yuan is your wife. Perhaps you have feelings for Lin Cece in your heart, but for a man, feelings aren't the most important. Responsibility is the most important. This time, if the child is gone, think about it yourself. Apart from the fact that you and Wen Yuan are done for, what should Nen do? Even if it's a transplant, will he have to suffer? There's also the rejection he'll have to suffer. Yi Mubai didn't say anything. He just silently looked outside. Yi Mulin looked at him. He could understand the pain in Yi Mubai's heart. Perhaps it was a contradiction. A woman that he didn't really care about suddenly didn't care about him. When he wanted to make it up to her, it was a terrible feeling. After a long time, he patted Yi Mubai's shoulder again. His voice was a little hoarse. Mubai, it's all in the past. Treat her well in the future. Wen Yuan is a good woman. I know. Yi Mubai turned and looked at him. After a while, he repeated bitterly, I know. Chapter 3861. Yi Mulin smiled. It's good that you know. Don't do anything stupid anymore. Mom and Dad aren't young anymore, and Uncle Hao dotes on them. Dad is alone and isn't doing well. Yi Mubai smiled bitterly. After a long while, he sighed. Did she say anything? She? You mean when you won? Yi Mulin smiled. Ask her yourself, if you want to know. He patted Yi Mubai's shoulder. All right, let's go home. He paused. I thought it was a big deal. That scoundrel agreed to drop the lawsuit after paying tens of thousands of dollars. He even said that he was in good health and didn't want to make such a big deal out of it in the future. It's too passive for me to come over and help you clean up the mess. The woman who doesn't come over will cry again. With that, he punched Yi Mubai's chest and led the way to the condominium. Yi Mubai finished his cigarette and followed. The door to the condominium opened. It was warm inside, and he stepped in. Yi Mulin had his wife by his side. There's no problem. I'm rushing for the private flight tonight. You guys have a good talk. With that, he glanced at Wen Yuan. Wen Yuan sat on the sofa and nodded slightly. She still had some respect for Yi Mulin. Bai Shuili was unhappy and grabbed her husband's hand when they were outside. You're leaving so soon? You want to stay and be the third wheel? He glared at her. Bai Shuili looked at him and felt a little wronged. But I can't leave just like that. I haven't had a good sleep yet. We're leaving tomorrow afternoon, he said suddenly. Riceworm gasped and looked at him in a daze. Really? Why did you lie just now? She added. Yi Mubai looked at her and said slowly after a while, Idiot. I'm not stupid. She jumped up and threw herself in his arms like a bear hugging a tree root. Yi Mulin looked down at her. Bai Shuili, how old are you? Why are you still so childish? I'm so childish. She leaned on his shoulder for him to carry her. Then she said coquettishly, You said I'm your baby. I did say that. He held her easily with one hand and pulled her ear with the other. Bai Shuili, do you believe what men say in bed? I just believe. She acted coquettishly, then wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him. Can you say it to me later? Yi Mulin stared at her, then reached out and patted her, but lightly. We're not going to the hotel to have sex. We're going to rest. He rubbed his forehead. I'm so tired. Mubai is so troublesome, and so are you. He held her in his arms as they walked in the soft snow. He shoved her into the car and got in after her. She stuck to him again and obediently lay in his arms. He was afraid that she was cold, so he opened his coat and let her nestle in his chest. She breathed into his chest through the coat, and it was warm and ticklish. Yi Mulin lowered his head and glanced at her silently. Then he closed his eyes and let her be. She was always teasing him. When he really couldn't stand it anymore, he gently pulled her hair and frowned. Bai Shuili, you're courting death. She smiled and nibbled on his shoulder. I thought you wouldn't be angry. He pinched her chin and forced her to look up. Then he said in a dangerous voice, Bai Shuili, it seems like you're not afraid at all. Chapter 3862. The consequences of provoking him were tragic. Bai Shuili was brought to the hotel, and after closing the door of the presidential suite, he brutally pressed her against the door and kissed her fiercely. He did not let her go until her legs went soft. One of his legs was still stuck there, and his eyes were burning. Are you still going to seduce me? Bai Shuili shamelessly sat on his lap and said coquettishly, I don't dare. She didn't dare. She was seducing him now. He was annoyed and amused at the same time. He reached out and flicked her forehead. You've been busy the whole day. Give me a massage. With that said, he carried her to the bed and threw her on it. He lay on his stomach. The person who was fooling around with him looked at his tired face and felt sorry for him. She sat down and massaged him, saying softly, You're very tired. What do you think? This was an old man's trick. Endless meetings, and the house is not peaceful. You're the one who makes the most noise. Just as he finished speaking, the person who was massaging him leaned over and hugged him from behind. Yi Mulin was annoyed and amused. He touched her face with the back of his hand. What's wrong? Are you acting coquettishly again? Or do you want to feel my warmth again? With that said, he turned over and pressed her down, kissing her chin. You're killing me. She knew that he had misunderstood, so she quickly hugged his neck and bit her lip. I'm not. As she said that, she lowered her gaze and reached out to hug Yi Mulin lightly. She said very softly, Yi Mulin, it's all because of me that you're working so hard, isn't it? He stared at her little face and smiled. Why are you suddenly so sentimental? He reached out to pinch her face deliberately. You're not such a sentimental person. I am now. She harumphed. At least I am for the next 2 days. She hugged his neck, wanting to hug him and kiss her. Mulin was annoyed and amused. She was really getting younger and younger. She was even more clingy and shameless than Anon. But he liked it. Or maybe he liked it. And that was why she was like this. Actually, she had always been trying to make him happy, trying to give him a little more fun after his hard work. His heart warmed. He reached out and gently pinched her face. Shueli, I actually have a lot of fun every day. She didn't understand and looked at him. He smiled and didn't tell her that it was fine as long as she was by his side. If she was by his side, he wouldn't feel that it was hard. Originally, Chief he had wanted to do something, but now he gave up. He turned to the side and pulled her into his arms, closing his eyes. Sleep with me. I'm really tired. He worked in politics and was good at scheming in front of people. He never made a wrong move. Only in front of her would he say that he was tired. Baishuali had been with him for a long time, so she was very sensible. She obediently lay on his chest, and after a while, she moved closer. Let me help you take off your shoes, okay? Seeing that he was so tired, her heart ached a little. Although she usually acted coquettishly, he was her man and the person she loved. Naturally, her heart ached. He grunted, and she went over to help him take off his shoes like a little maid. She was very diligent. Mulin looked down at her for a while and smiled. He did not say anything else and kept his eyes closed. After a while, she obediently climbed into his arms and slept with him. Chapter 3863. She was very obedient, he thought to himself. Others could only see that he was always doing things for her, but Shirley was actually very good to him, and it was enough for him to know. He closed his eyes, hugged her in his arms, and patted her little head. I'll take you shopping tomorrow. It seems like I haven't been with you for a long time. Baishuali yelped and looked up at him. She thought that he didn't know, but it was as if he had grown a third eye. He smiled silently. Baishuali, can you work harder? You've already used me so many times. Don't look like you haven't tasted it yet, okay? She pushed herself up a little. What's sex? Mulin, you're too rough. Is that so? He pulled her down and turned around, pressing against her. Their faces were hot. Her face was red, and she bit her lip as she said, Mulin, didn't you say you wanted to sleep? Yes, I want to sleep. His long fingers caressed her face gently. Sleep with me. Her face turned even redder. He leaned over and bit the tip of her nose. Baishuali, don't tell me that you don't want me to sleep with you. Her face turned red again, and she bit her lip. Mulin, I don't. I think you want to have sex. He chuckled. You've been sticking to me today. Baishuali's mind was in a mess. She wanted to cry, but no tears came out. Mulin was the best of the best in the eyes of others. He was a good lawyer, and he was very proud of himself in the political circles. But in front of her, he was shameless and had a very wicked sense of humor. Every time, he was the one who wanted to do it, and he was the one who made her cry and beg for mercy, saying that she was a pervert, that she was lustful, and that she wanted his body. Baishuali felt that her married life was perfect, except for that one thing. He was extremely perverted and shameless. In the end, he still got his way. It was clearly what he wanted. His stamina was abnormally good. Even though he said that he was very tired, he could still cling on to her without resting. Baishuali almost wanted to cry, but he still didn't look satisfied. She had no choice but to shamelessly beg for mercy, saying that he was very powerful. So what? She would say whatever he wanted to hear now. Mulin chuckled and nibbled on the tip of her nose as he whipped her. Are you satisfied? She nodded furiously. He smiled lazily and ended it hastily. He had finally let her off this time. After that, he went to take a shower. Baishuali lay on the bed like a limp shrimp. She angrily thought to herself, how is he accompanying me? It's clearly me accompanying him. There are benefits to accompanying a secretary abroad. The more she thought about it, the angrier she got. She bit the pillow. Mulin came back from the shower and sat beside her. He patted her and said, I'm not going to shower. I don't want to. She bit the pillow and gave him an angry look. Her legs were so sore. How was she going to go shopping tomorrow? She wasn't naive enough to think that he would let her go today. Mulin's style was to rest for a few hours and then come again. He was clearly the one who was lustful, but he had to make it seem like it was her every time. It was infuriating. He smiled. Be good and sleep. I have something to do. I'll accompany you when I come back. Chapter 3864. He smiled. I'm meeting a friend. Baishuali didn't think much about it and let him go. She even felt sorry for him. But later, she found out that her husband climbed out of her bed and went to see Ai Wei. His first love, Lao Qing, was seen on the news. She packed her luggage and wanted to go back to China by herself. She was angry, no matter why he wanted to see Ai Wei. Yim Yulin didn't want to catch up with Ai Wei. It was business. But the moment he came back, he saw his rice worm packing her luggage and was about to leave. He pulled his tie and said helplessly, angry again? Baishuali stepped on his foot. Let go of me. I want to divorce you, you bastard. He didn't care about her tricks and pushed the suitcase aside. He sat on the edge of the bed and reached out to pull her over. He carefully looked into her eyes. Did you cry? He sighed. You like to cry so much. She did not say anything and turned her head away. I have something to talk to her about. He sighed again and wiped the tears off her face. Don't cry. You're crying like a little monkey. She still did not want to talk to him. He smiled. I've done everything. If I really want to do something with her, I'll take anything. She finally looked up and glared at him. Shameless. He pulled her into his arms and said hoarsely, Shueli, stop fooling around. Actually, at this moment, he was troubled while she was throwing a tantrum. But his heart was full and especially soft. She believed him. It was just a bit of ritual to fool around. Yim Yulin kissed her nose. Don't cry, or I'll do it to you like before. You said you didn't. She sat in his arms and bit his Adam's apple. It was especially tempting. He chuckled and let her sit on his lap. He bit the tip of her nose, too. If you want it, I'll have it. No way. She wrapped her arms around his neck and stopped fooling around. I'm hungry. I want to eat. She was angry that he did not give her any food even after teasing her for so long. He wanted to eat with Ai Wei. The more she thought about it, the angrier she got. If she continued to bother with him, she would be a bastard. But after they got back together, every time they quarreled, they would reconcile after half an hour. There was no way they could quarrel for too long, because they had been lonely for too long. Asterisk on the other side, Yi Mubai slowly walked into the apartment. Wen Yuan was sitting there. He didn't say anything, just walked over and squatted down in front of her, hugging her gently. Wen Yuan didn't push him away. She lowered her eyes and looked at him. He didn't come back for the whole night. He didn't look as handsome as he usually did. Instead, he looked a little more miserable. He hugged her and said in a low voice, Wen Yuan, let's start over, okay? Wen Yuan placed her hand on his black hair gently. His body froze for a moment. She said softly, Yimu Bai, I can't even convince myself. Don't make things difficult for me, and don't make things difficult for yourself either. Isn't it good to be peaceful like this? She paused for a moment. If you feel that life is really boring and lonely, you can find some fun of your own. Really, I won't interfere. Just don't let Xiangnan see it. After she said that, he raised his head and stared at her. His gaze was a little unfamiliar, as though he had never seen her before. Slowly, he said, Wen Yuan, are you saying that you want me to have an affair? Chapter 3865. She didn't make a sound and just looked at him with an indulgent expression. Yi Mubai stared at her for about half a minute before he said softly, Wen Yuan, I really want to strangle you to death. At that moment, he wished so badly that he didn't have to worry about Xiangnan or the child in her belly. Their world was just the two of them. He could force her, use all sorts of methods to force her to accept and still love him. But he couldn't. He closed his eyes. Everything could be forced, but not feelings. When he opened his eyes again, there was a hint of disappointment in them. It was a very obvious disappointment. He slowly got up and stared at her for a long time before he took a step back and said in a low voice, You're right, but Wen Yuan, do you know that you've sentenced me to death, but it's a reprieve? The expression in his eyes was almost sorrowful. It was an expression that could only appear when one was tortured by feelings. But Wen Yuan didn't want to experience it anymore. After experiencing life and death, she didn't want to be a woman who loved someone else anymore. She wanted to be herself again. Yi Mubai went to the study and stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling window to smoke. In his heart, he knew very well that everything Wen Yuan did was to say goodbye to him, to divorce him, to draw a clear line between them. He lowered his eyes and smiled bitterly. Let go. He might have in the past, but not anymore. He remembered the pain in his heart when she was lying in the hospital. He never thought that he would feel pain for Wen Yuan. Those days, he forgot about Lin Cici's life and death. He didn't even care or ask about it. What he cared about was whether Wen Yuan would wake up and whether she would forgive him. He stood and smoked, thinking about that morning when she tugged at his sleeve and said that she wasn't feeling well. He thought that the despair in Wen Yuan's heart back then was as unforgiving as he was now. Yi Mubai looked at the gentle snow and thought about a lot of things. In the end, he didn't force her anymore. They resumed their previous life, which was also what she wanted, a lukewarm life. He treated her well, while she remained cold to him, but she did not throw a tantrum at him. This was actually a form of cold violence. She silently rejected all of his efforts. From then on, he did not do anything out of line. Even if there was something, he would solve it himself and not force her. Wen Yuan knew about it, but she didn't say anything. At night, she slept on her side. It was almost 11 o'clock when Yi Mubai came back from the study. He deliberately waited for her to fall asleep so that she wouldn't fall asleep in his arms. He knew she did not want him to hold her, but even if she did not want to, even if they were only in name, he wanted to hold her. One day, he thought she would come around. One day, Yi Mubai took a shower in the guest room. When she crept into the room, Wen Yuan was already asleep. The bedside lamp was on, and there was a book beside her hand. He walked over and picked it up. He looked at it silently for a while. No matter what their relationship was, there was no way to erase the fact that she was a good mother. She did it not only for Xiangnan, but also for the child in her belly. Just like his brother said, Wen Yuan was a good woman. He looked at it silently, then pursed his lips and put the book on the bedside table. He lay behind her, his fingers silently stroking her belly. This was his entertainment every night. The child was about 7 months old. It could move and could feel him. Chapter 38:66. With just a touch, he felt her body stiffen. He knew that she wasn't asleep, so he said softly, Wen Yuan, can we talk? Talk about what? He thought that she wouldn't speak, but she did. Yi Mubai was a little happy. Then, he said in a hoarse voice, let's talk about the child's name, okay? She was the one who came up with Yi Xiangnan's name. As for the child in her belly, he wanted to name it himself. Wen Yuan was stunned for a moment. Then he seemed to be energized. You remember? He grunted and then moved his face over. In a low voice, he said, the boy will be called Yi Hui, and the girl will be called Yi Hui. Okay? Wen Yuan was silent for a long time before he said softly, pretty good. She said that she wanted to sleep, but he didn't want to let her sleep after talking to her for a while. He said in a hoarse voice, don't you want to know what it means? She was silent to save face for both parties. For Wen Yuan, there were some things that could not be reversed once they happened. After they got married, he gave her gifts and said all kinds of nice things to her. She really thought that they would be together forever. It was destroyed so quickly. She felt that she had not experienced the beauty of a relationship before she was ruthlessly pulled back to reality. She thought that would be great if they didn't love again. If they didn't love again, she wouldn't be so sad. She wouldn't be wondering why he ignored her discomfort that day and chose to look for Qin to save Lin Cici. She had entered some kind of spell and couldn't get out. Wen Yuan said, his voice a little faint in the dark, Yi Mubai, actually, it's not important anymore. She turned in his arms and looked up at him. In the dark, no one could see each other's expressions. It was very safe. What's important? His voice was a little shaky. She shook her head. Nothing. Just as she was about to turn her back, he caught her again. Wen Yuan, don't tell me that your heart is still as water. You're not like this. His voice was really hoarse. If you insist on living like this, I can stay with you, but I won't divorce. After he finished speaking, he let go of her and stopped talking as if he was angry. Wen Yuan was stunned for a moment. Then he held onto his stomach and struggled to turn over. He still opened his eyes and gently helped her turn over. Then, he held onto the side of her body without letting go. She wanted to say something, but he continued in a hoarse voice, "I won't let go." 1 yuan. In the blink of an eye, Wen Yuan's belly became bigger and bigger. When she was 8 months pregnant, it was already difficult for her to walk. When she went to the prenatal checkup, it was difficult for her to get out of the car. Yi Mubai had to help her get in. After the examination, there was nothing wrong with the child. Because of the previous accident, the doctor told the pregnant woman that there must be someone by her side in the last month or so, because she could give birth prematurely at any time. Yi Mubai nodded. Wen Yuan looked at the doctor. "I want to be hospitalized." The doctor smiled. "There's really no need for that. It's still a long time, and the hospital is very stuffy. It's not good for the pregnant woman's mood." Wen Yuan's lips twitched, but he didn't say anything else. On the way back, Yi Mubai helped her into the car and fastened his seatbelt slowly. Then he looked at her and asked, "What's wrong? Are you unhappy because you're not hospitalized?" His voice was a little coaxing. The doctor said that being hospitalized is not good for the pregnant woman's mood. Wen Yuan looked down and turned her face away. "It's fine if you don't want to stay. Let's drive." Bookmark for easier reading. Chapter 38:67. He doesn't start the car immediately. Instead, he looks at her sideways. "Don't be afraid. I will always be with you. Nothing will happen." With that, he shakes her hand and starts the car. On the way home, no one said a word. He knew that that day was a shadow in Di Wenyuan's heart. She was afraid. His heart hurts a little, but he can't let her sink into it. One day, she has to understand that he is sincere to her and that they can be happy. Yi Mubai drives to the door of the apartment. When the car stops, she unfastens the seatbelt and wants to get out of the car. He grabs her hand and leans over to hug her. He doesn't say anything. He just holds her for about a minute and then lets go. His voice is a little hoarse. "Don't move. I'll help you get out." Wen Yuan watches him get out of the car, walk around the front of the car, and open the door for her. She tilts her head and meets his eyes. "Get out of the car." He holds her arm and leads her out of the car. He closes the door with one hand. Wen Yuan takes a nap after returning home. When she wakes up, she hears that Xiangnan is making noise. She blinks her eyes and immediately lifts the quilt to get up. However, she falls back again. Her body is so heavy that she can't get up at once. Her name is Mrs. Lin. It is Yi Mubai who comes over. He looks a little haggard, but he is still very gentle. "What's wrong?" He comes over and holds her down to stop her from moving. Wen Yuan looks at him. "What's wrong with Xiangnan?" Yi Mubai asks Mrs. Lin to go out first and then covers her with a quilt. Wen Yuan remembers that he is holding her down again. "Don't move." He pauses for a moment and then says Xiangnan has a little fever. It's 38 degrees Celsius. The doctor came. Wen Yuan is still worried. "Do you want to go to the hospital? Let's keep an eye on him. Don't go if it's less than 38 degrees Celsius. It's not good for him." His voice is very gentle. Then he lowers his head and kisses her forehead. "You sleep a little longer. I won't go out. Don't worry." With that, he gets up and goes out. Wen Yuan was half lying down. The master bedroom was quiet. She could vaguely hear his and Xiangnan's voices. Later, when Xiangnan stopped messing around, she was worried, so she struggled to get up and walked into the children's room. He gently pushed the door open and saw Xiangnan sitting on a small sofa in a cute little nightgown. Yi Mulin was reading a book to him. He was dressed very casually in gray casual pants and a gray sweater. Xiangnan was leaning against him with a cooling pad on his forehead, but his expression was very gentle. He was also looking at his father with great reliance. At this time, Wen Yuan realized that if she and Yi Mubai were to separate, the ones who would suffer the most would be Xiangnan and the child in her belly. He wanted to be a good husband and father. She could refuse, but she had no right to refuse on behalf of the child. This was somewhat unfair. When Yuan's fingers gently touched his lower abdomen as he pursed his lips, Yi Mubai looked up and saw her. He frowned. "Why did you come out? Go back to the room and rest." When Yuan didn't understand, he said, "Xiangnan has a cold. Do you want it to be contagious?" When Yuan was stunned for a moment and looked at Xiangnan. Xiangnan's voice was crisp. "I will be obedient, Mom." Wen Yuan smiled faintly and left. Yimu Bai looked at her back and felt a little excited. She hadn't smiled in front of him for a long time. Even in front of Xiangnan, as long as he was around, she would be very restrained. End of this chapter. Chapter 3868. Only God knew how much he wanted to hold her, how much he wanted to kiss the smile on her lips, and keep it. Yimu Bai's gaze was a little worried. Xiangnan pulled him back. Dad, you haven't finished. Yimu Bai snapped back to reality and continued to tell his son the story. He was a little excited, but he couldn't quite put it into words. He felt that when Yuan's attitude had changed a little. Although he was excited, he still patiently coaxed his son and took Xiangnan's temperature. It dropped to 37.5 degrees. He heaved a sigh of relief and ordered the kitchen to make porridge for Xiangnan when he woke up. This little guy hadn't eaten anything all day. After giving the instructions, Yimu Bai went to the study to deal with some matters. Recently, the box office of a movie he filmed was very popular. He didn't go to any of the events, but at least he had to pay attention to it sometimes. There were some occasions that required him to take some videos. There were also some company matters that he had to deal with. Suemo had helped him a lot. Another reason why he valued Suemo was that he was someone that Wen Yuan could accept. When Yimu Bai finished his work, it was already more than an hour later. When he got up, he was a little tired. He smoked in the study to relieve his fatigue and took a shower before returning to the master bedroom. Wen Yuan still got up and was reading in the living room. Hearing his footsteps, she turned her head. How's Xiangnan? The fever has gone down a little. You should be fine. He closed the door of the master bedroom and walked towards her. After taking a shower, he was only wearing a black bathrobe. Even though it was just a simple bathrobe, it still accentuated his extremely good figure, especially with the loose collar. Wen Yuan could even see a few sturdy abdominal muscles, evenly distributed and shining with a seductive luster. She looked away, not wanting to look at him again, but he said in a hoarse voice, "You're willing to talk to me, aren't you?" "I don't know." Her voice was soft and hoarse. He was still looking up at her. His voice and posture were a little humble. "But you're willing to live with me, aren't you?" He was really a very smart man. She had only smiled slightly, but he could guess her thoughts and come over to tease her. Wen Yuan lowered his gaze. "Didn't you say that you wouldn't divorce me?" He placed his hand on her knee and said in a low voice, "Wen Yuan, there are many ways for a married couple to get along with each other. We probably had a particularly bad relationship in the past. What I'm trying to say is, let's change our way of getting along, okay?" He could temporarily not ask her to love him, but he was a normal man. If they continued like this, he did not know how long this marriage could last. Tormenting each other like that wouldn't be pleasant, and it wouldn't be good for the child either. Wen Yuan should understand that as well. She had refused to communicate with him before, but now he had to have a good talk with her. He wanted her to know that he didn't want to give up. It wasn't just that he didn't want a divorce. He wanted a lot more. Wen Yuan looked at him quietly and did not say anything. She didn't know how to answer, and she didn't know why he was so insistent. Wouldn't it be better to give birth to the child and then let go? He didn't like her that much, let alone love her. As for what he said, she could consider it, but she refused to discuss it with him in her heart. In her heart, she probably rejected him. Reject a man, no matter how good to her now, but once abandoned her for another woman. Chapter 3869. The discussion was fruitless, but he decided how they should interact. He was still very gentle with her, and Wen Yuan wasn't as cold as before. That night, he was very tired from taking care of Xiangnan. When he returned to the room, it was almost 11 o'clock. He sat by the bed and touched her face. "The fever has subsided. You're fine now." Wen Yuan turned her body sideways and was gently touched by him. She looked at him and asked softly, "Are you tired?" He replied vaguely, but he didn't go to take a shower. Instead, he leaned over and kissed her lips. He hadn't kissed her like this in a very long time, ever since she hated him. After kissing her, he was a little excited and couldn't control himself. It wasn't that he hadn't had women before, but this time was really different. When he kissed her, he felt the blood in his body boiling. Even though she was pregnant, he couldn't do anything at all. He just kissed her like this, almost intoxicated. After kissing her for a long time, he let go of her a little and pressed his forehead against hers. His voice was even more hoarse. "When you on, I'm very happy." "What are you happy about?" Her voice was as hoarse as his. He caressed her face delicately and slowly, as though he had a lifetime to do this. When Yuan buried her face in the white pillow. She wanted to hide, but he didn't let her. After what felt like a century, he finally retracted his hand and said hoarsely, "When Yuan, you know it in your heart." "I don't know," she said, sounding a little willful. Yi Mubai smiled and kissed her for a while. "Go to sleep. I'm going to take a shower and go see Xiangnan later." When Yuan looked at him and realized that he had lost a lot of weight. He had been taking care of her for the past few months, and now with Xiangnan, he couldn't get a good rest. She pursed her lips and said, "Go to sleep for a while. I'll set an alarm." Yi Mubai was stunned for a moment. He couldn't believe what he had heard. After a while, he laid down beside her softly, hugging her carefully and burying his face in her neck. He was indeed tired, but he couldn't bear to sleep while hugging her like this. He just hugged her like this, closing his eyes and smelling the fragrance of her hair. It was a good night's sleep. When Yi Mubai woke up, the sky was bright. The sunlight shone through the transparent window onto the big bed. It was very comfortable. His Adam's apple moved slightly. He reached out to block the sunlight and propped himself up. Xiangnan's voice rang in his ears. He was talking to Wen Yuan. Yi Mubai listened carefully. There was a charming smile on his handsome face, and the corners of his mouth were slightly raised. After a long time, he lifted the blanket, brushed his teeth, washed his face, and walked out. Xiangnan had already recovered. He looked at him happily and called him Daddy. Yi Mubai picked him up and kissed him. "Dad, check if you're all right." He hugged Xiangnan and placed his hand on his forehead. "It's not hot anymore." She then asked if Xiangnan had eaten breakfast. Xiangnan's voice was loud and clear. "I ate with Mom." Yi Mubai put him down and went to the dining table. The servants served him breakfast. He drank a mouthful of milk and asked Wen Yuan calmly, "Did you go see Xiangnan last night?" Wen Yuan grunted. "You didn't wake up." He smiled. "Really? You didn't turn off the alarm clock?" She didn't say anything. Perhaps she was still not used to talking to him like this. Yi Mubai didn't force her either. They were already very good like this. He was very satisfied. Chapter 3870. He was eating breakfast. Wen Yuan slowly walked to the French window and sat in front of the piano that he had bought for her. Her slender fingers landed on the keys. Yi Mubai looked at her and put down the breakfast in his hand. His eyes were a little hot. He knew what her actions meant. It meant that she would not leave him. His voice was hoarse. "Wen Yuan," she hummed and said softly, "I want to play a few songs." With that, she began to play the piano. She played very well. In his heart, she was much better than Lin Shui. He listened carefully. She played a few songs in a row, then stopped and said softly, "Yi Mubai, I want to wait until the child is born and Xiangnan's condition has stabilized. Let's go back to City B." She paused for a moment and turned her head. "Yi Mubai, I don't want to hide anymore." He looked at her quietly and said, "Okay." Then he realized that Wen Yuan was a little different. As for what was different, he thought that this was probably the original Wen Yuan. She seemed to want to reconcile with him, but in fact, she had become more rational. Her feelings for him had changed from hatred to unwillingness to hate. It wasn't much better. However, her smile and the way she talked to him were especially precious to him. He couldn't bear to reject her. When Wen Yuan was no longer in a cold war with him, the days seemed to be especially warm, and there was a very beautiful feeling. Other than going out occasionally, Yi Mubai usually stayed at home to accompany her. Sometimes Wen Yuan would take a walk, do simple exercises, and sometimes play the piano. She was still born prematurely, but only 2 weeks early. The moment her water broke, she was stunned. Then, she reached out and grabbed Yi Mubai. "Yi Mubai, I might be giving birth." It was nighttime. Yi Mubai woke up immediately. He sat up and held on to her. He shook his head and woke up 2 seconds later. His voice was calm. "Don't be afraid. I'll take you to the hospital." Since the last time, the chauffeur at home had been on standby 24 hours. Suemo had also stayed over these few days. Everything was to deal with emergencies. Yimubai quickly put on his clothes and helped Wen Yuan put on a coat. His things were already packed. He woke up Suemo and two of his servants. Two of them stayed to take care of Wen Yuan while he brought one of the servants with him to the hospital. She was in so much pain that she couldn't walk, so he had to carry her. After Wen Yuan became pregnant, she had grown to 120 centimeters. He carried her from home to the car, and then from the car to the delivery room of the hospital. He walked for a few hundred meters, and his arms were heavy and painful, but he didn't rest at all. The doctor and nurse pushed a trolley over. Yimubai carefully placed her on the trolley and ran with them. His fingers gently stroked her face, and he said in a low voice, "Wen Yuan, don't be afraid. I'll always be here." She was in so much pain that her forehead was covered in sweat. He kissed her away, his heart aching. "I'm right here." He asked to accompany the baby, and the doctor agreed. Yimubai changed her clothes and entered the delivery room. Wen Yuan was in so much pain that he bit his lips. His expression was very painful. He squatted down beside her and said in a low voice, "Wen Yuan, scream if it hurts." Her hair was wet with sweat, and her face was a little pale from overexertion. Only now did he know that giving birth could be so painful. So, when she gave birth for the first time, he wasn't by her side. Did it hurt even more? He held her hand and placed it next to his face. "Wen Yuan, I'm sorry." Her eyes were wide open, and she was panting heavily. Her whole body was stiff. Chapter 3871. The doctor and nurses kept encouraging and cheering her on. They even gave Wen Yuan a piece of chocolate. After enduring for 2 hours, Wen Yuan felt that she was about to run out of energy. She blinked and saw Yimubai's face in front of her. She suddenly screamed in pain. All the pain, all the past, all the grievances were contained in that scream. He hugged her, and it was as if a surge of energy was injected into her body. Wen Yuan used all her strength, and finally, amidst the heart-wrenching pain, she heard the cry of a baby. Wen Yuan's heart relaxed, and she slowly lay flat. She was very, very tired. She wanted to sleep for 3 days and 3 nights. The baby was still crying loudly. The doctor smiled and said, "What a healthy baby." It was so cute. After the doctor washed it, he couldn't help but pat the baby's butt. Yimubai took a look and then leaned over to Wen Yuan's ear. He said in a low voice, "It's a little girl. Wen Yuan, we have a daughter." He was very happy to be a father, and his heart ached for Wen Yuan's pain. He kissed her when Wen Yuan woke up. The ward was bright. As it was a panoramic ward, the view was very good. The sun shone directly in, and it made the pregnant woman feel very relaxed. She was still in some pain and let out a low cry. Yimubai immediately went forward and said in a hoarse voice, "You're awake. Do you want to drink some water and eat something?" Wen Yuan, you've slept for almost 24 hours. She was still weak. She lay there quietly and looked at him. "Where's the child?" "She's asleep, lying on the little bed." Yimubai's voice was soft, as if he was afraid to startle her or the child. Wen Yuan nodded and then watched as he went over and carefully pushed the little bed over. A beautiful little girl appeared in front of Wen Yuan. Although Wen Yuan had imagined what a child would look like, she was still very touched when she really appeared in front of her. She reached out and touched the little girl gently. The little girl frowned and looked like she was about to cry. Wen Yuan quickly retracted her hand and smiled. "She seems to have a bad temper." Yimubai also moved back quietly and looked at the little fellow fondly. Then he came back. "Let me help you up. Can you sit down?" The auntie just brought some soup over and fried some vegetables. "I'm afraid you'll be too greasy and won't taste good." Wen Yuan nodded and sat up with his help. Yimubai went to pour a glass of water. He sat beside her and let her head rest on his shoulder while he held the cup and fed her. Wen Yuan smelled the refreshing smell on his body. It smelled very good. She knew that he had taken a bath here. She looked at herself again. It was quite bad. Her hair should be very messy, and her body also smelled bad. A woman who had just given birth would not be much better. Her mind wandered and she choked. "What are you thinking about?" Yimubai took a tissue and helped her wipe her face. Aren't you thinking too much? Wen Yuan glanced at him. Because he was too weak, he didn't even have the strength to argue. After he fed her water, he scooped a bowl of soup for her. It was very nourishing and not greasy. He fed her a bowl first and then let her eat. As Wen Yuan ate, she looked at him. I want to brush my teeth. Eat first. Brush after you're done, he said lightly. I don't mind you. Wen Yuan, she didn't want him to feed her, but he insisted. In the end, he fed her and carried her to the bathroom. Chapter 38:72. She had just given birth to a child, so she felt uncomfortable and disheveled. At this time, Wen Yuan missed the scene of giving birth in the past. It was inconvenient for Yi Mulin to take care of him, so he asked the nursing center to take care of him, and she didn't have to worry about being seen by others. She looked at him and said, I want to take a bath. Yi Mubai paused and stared at her in the mirror for a long time before saying softly, It's been less than 24 hours. Let's wait another day. You're still very weak. If you're uncomfortable, I'll help you wipe it. No need. She refused him. However, he still saw that she was uncomfortable. He pressed her to sit down and took a hot towel to wipe her carefully. From top to bottom, every inch of her body was changed by him. After he finished wiping, he carefully helped her tidy up her clothes and said softly, I called Qin Shun to come and operate on Xiangnan. Xiangnan has been admitted to the hospital. After the examination, he is in good condition. We could take care of him in the hospital for a while. Wen Yuan looked at him with a blank gaze. Then she grabbed his sleeve and said bitterly, Are you confident about the operation? His voice was very hoarse. Don't worry. There will be no problem if Qin Shun comes. Wen Yuan was relieved. He helped her back to the ward. Wen Yuan had been lying down for a day. She wanted to take a walk, so she went to see the newborn little guy. She held the railing and whispered, Call her Yi Hui. He hugged her from behind and tightened his arms. She had just given birth, but her waist was a little slender. He took a deep breath in her neck and said nothing. He just hugged her. She had given birth to a child, but he felt like he had taken a walk through the gates of hell. After hugging for a long time, Yi Mubai whispered, Wen Yuan, I won't let you give birth to another child in the future. He didn't want her to experience the heart-wrenching pain when she gave birth again. He wanted to have a vasectomy. And all of this, Yi Mubai hid it from Wen Yuan. He didn't want her to feel burdened. Later, he secretly went to have a vasectomy. In the afternoon, Xiangnan came to visit his sister with a face mask on. He lay by the side and looked at the fair baby, unable to tear his eyes away. After a long time, he reluctantly raised his eyes. Sister, you're so beautiful. Wen Yuan smiled. My sister's name is Yi Hui, the fennel. Xiangnan nodded and stared blankly at the cutie until it was taken away by Qin Shun. Qin Shun handed Xiangnan over to Su Mo, and he came over to talk about the operation plan with Yi Mubai. Yi Mubai also talked very seriously with the world's best surgeon. He thought that he was very sincere, but Qin Shun was not such a person. His medical skills were decent, but whether he was decent or not was another matter. After discussing the plan, Qin Shun asked for an exorbitant sum of 7 figures for the operation fee. Usually, when he met a big sheep like Yi Mubai, Qin Shun would never be polite. Otherwise, how could he guarantee the quality of her body and her life? Yi Mubai didn't care about this. He only wanted Xiangnan to be well. He knew that Qin Shun was worth the price, because no matter how much money he had, Qin Shun might not be willing to do the operation. In short, this was a doctor who knew how to enjoy himself. After talking about the business, Qin Shun took the check from Yi Mubai's hand. When he saw that there were so many zeros in front of it, he flicked it and said, The men of the Yi family are quite good. I'll give you a set meal. Yi Mubai wanted to refuse because his elder brother was miserably bullied by the set meal. Chapter 38:73. But Qin Shun had already said, Cece heard that you gave birth to a daughter, so she gave me a gift and asked me to bring it over. Yi Mubai really wanted to strangle her. But Qin Shun had already placed the gift on Wen Yuan's bedside and smiled. Cece's gift. She said she couldn't come and asked me to send her regards. Wen Yuan smiled lightly. Qin Shun looked at Yi Mubai and then left with one hand in her pocket. After she left, Yi Mubai's voice was a little bitter. "Wen Yuan, do you have anything to say to me?" Wen Yuan took the gift box and said as he opened it, "Qin Shun is very handsome." Yi Mubai didn't expect such an answer. He frowned. "Wen Yuan, that's not what I want to say." Qin Shun had already opened the gift and was stunned. In the box, there was a small doll. It was very cute and made of crystal. It was fragile and beautiful. Wen Yuan looked at it and blinked. She liked it very much. Yi Mubai looked at her quietly, trying to find any change in her expression. But Wen Yuan didn't let him find such a change. She just looked at the gift for a long time before putting it away again. Yi Mubai's voice was bitter. "If you like it, I'll bring the gift for my parents, my brother, and Shueli for you to look at, okay?" She shook her head and lay down. "I'm a little tired." Yi Mubai went over and half squatted in front of her, looking at her expression carefully. "Are you angry?" "No." She closed her eyes and said softly, "The problem between us has nothing to do with Lin Cece." After she finished speaking, he didn't say anything. After a long time, she opened her eyes and saw him looking at her without blinking. Wen Yuan smiled faintly. "What's wrong?" "Nothing." Yi Mubai smiled faintly and reached out to touch her head. "All right, go to sleep." She closed her eyes. He accompanied her for a while and went outside to smoke a cigarette. Wen Yuan might not have realized what she had just blurted out, but he had. She said that there was a problem between them. Actually, it was just that it had faded in life. She didn't mention it, and he didn't mention it either. It seemed like everything was in the past, but it wasn't. That incident had always been in Wen Yuan's heart, and the pain had always been there. She didn't say it for the sake of the two children. Yi Mubai was very clear. He had always been very clear. But when she said it so unintentionally, he still felt very sad. He didn't know what to say to her. Or should he escape with her? After such a long time, he once again felt helpless. He once again realized that he was excluded by her, even though she did not show it. Yi Mubai closes his eyes and smokes several cigarettes outside before returning to the ward. Two nurses smell the cigarette on Yi Mubai. One of them lowers her voice and scolds him. "Mr. Yi, pregnant women and newborns can't smell the cigarette. You are accompanying them. If you can't control yourself, you can ask someone else." Yi Mubai looked at the young nurse. The young nurse also stared at him. She didn't give in at all because he was rich and good-looking. After a long time, Yi Mubai said in a hoarse voice, "She's right. You shouldn't smoke." He took out the cigarette and threw it into the trash can. The young nurse's face became a little better. Yi Mubai watched her go out and close the door. Then he met Wen Yuan's gaze. He smiled. "She's right. You shouldn't smoke." Chapter 3874. Then, he walked directly to little Yi Hui's little bed to play with her. The little fellow was asleep at first, but later, probably because of the smell of smoke, she burst into tears. Yi Mubai was stunned. He looked at the little girl and then at Wen Yuan. He was at a loss. "Why is she crying? You're making her sick." Wen Yuan's voice was a little reproachful. Then, she lifted the blanket and got up. Yi Mubai stopped her. "Don't get up. I'll coax her. Let me do it." Wen Yuan's voice was very soft. Then she got out of bed. She looked much better than before. She skillfully carried little Yi Hui in his arms and patted her gently. She even hummed a song to the little girl. Her voice was very gentle. At this moment, Wen Yuan was only wearing pajamas, but she looked indescribably gentle and motherly, especially when she was coaxing little Yi Hui. Yi Mubai felt as if he was looking at a starry sky. Wen Yuan was the one humming a lullaby. He looked at her greedily and couldn't bear to look away. Wen Yuan was coaxing the little girl. She had taken care of Xiangnan before, so little Yi Hui was easily coaxed. She closed her eyes in her arms and looked very cute. Yi Mubai was amazed. He looked at her from the side and said softly, "Is she asleep?" Wen Yuan's expression was very gentle because she was facing the child. She said softly, "Put her back on the little bed. You have to wash your hands and brush your teeth. Then, take a shower and change your clothes." Yi Mubai took the child and said, "Is she that delicate?" As soon as he said that, little Yi Hui started crying again. She wrinkled her little nose and opened her eyes to burst into tears. He was shocked. Was a little girl this delicate? But he wasn't angry. Instead, his heart was very soft. He hugged the little girl and coaxed her, but the little girl didn't listen to him. Not only did she not listen to him, but she also cried very fiercely. Yimu Bai had always been a gifted student. When Xiangnan followed him, he was already a big kid, so he had always been good. But now, he had to take care of a newborn baby, so he didn't have much experience. He tried to coax her in a flurry, but the little fellow just kept on crying. Moreover, she became more and more energetic, and her little face was completely red. Looking at her made his heart ache. Yimu Bai reached out to comfort him, but the little guy immediately sucked on his fingers as if he was hungry. He tilted his head. Is she hungry? Previously, when Yuan was asleep, he didn't want to wake her up, so he fed her milk powder. Now, Yimu Bai's gaze fell on a certain place. His eyes were deep and burning. When he opened his mouth, his voice was a little light. Do you have one now? Wen Yuan naturally knew what he was talking about. He pursed his lips and took little Yi Hui from his arms. Little Yi Hui probably smelled the scent on Wen Yuan's body, so she immediately moved closer and cuddled in Wen Yuan's arms. Yimu Bai's gaze was fixed on her. Wen Yuan glanced at him, walked to the bed, and sat down. She unbuttoned her pajamas with her back to him. The little girl instinctively went over to eat. The sound of her swallowing made Yimu Bai want to swallow his saliva. He felt a little uncomfortable. He should have avoided her, but his feet just couldn't move. He just couldn't bear to move away. Little Yi Hui had a big appetite. After finishing one side, she would eat the other side. She took turns to finish it, and only then did she let out a satisfied yawn. She was very cute. From the side, she looked like a little rabbit. Chapter 38:75. Yimu Bai looked at her eagerly, and his eyes were a little envious. On the one hand, it was because of little Yi Hui's cuteness, and, on the other hand, it was because Wen Yuan was not dressed properly. It was open, and he couldn't fasten it while holding the little fellow. But if he put Yi Hui down at this time, it would be even more unbearable. Wen Yuan pursed his lower lip and looked at Yimu Bai. Take Yi Hui there. Yimu Bai's voice was hoarse. I'm afraid she will cry again. She won't cry. Wen Yuan emphasized his tone, and then bit his lip. Take her there. But his eyes were still looking at her eagerly, and he was reluctant to look away. Wen Yuan was a little angry. Yimu Bai. Only then did he smile and carefully held Yi Hui in his arms. Wen Yuan immediately buttoned up the coat. After fastening it, she looked up and met his eyes. Yimu Bai didn't continue to look at her. In fact, he couldn't see it anymore. He carefully carried the little fellow to the small bed. She was different when she was full. Her little face was pink, and her eyes were gently closed. He was surprised to find that little Yi Hui's eyelashes were very long, which was like him. He didn't remember that Xiangnan's eyelashes were so long. His eyes were still on Yi Hui's face, and he asked Wen Yuan softly, was Xiangnan so cute when he was born? Wen Yuan thought for a moment. Girls are always more delicate. He didn't say anything, but kept looking at little Yi Hui. He only felt that she was particularly beautiful, not worse than Baianan. Yimu Bai looked at her for a long time, and then said, I'd better take a shower and change my clothes. I don't want to suffocate her. Then he reached out and pinched the little fellow's face lovingly. She's so delicate. Wen Yuan watched him enter the bathroom, and thought that he looked very happy. It seemed that he was a lot more relaxed after having Yi Hui, except for the time when he went to smoke. He hugged the quilt, looked at Yi Hui, and then thought it was very unrealistic for an old woman to fantasize about love all day long. Moreover, they had 2 children to raise. No matter who the children followed, they would be missing. When Yuan's way of thinking wasn't actually giving in, but making do. He meant to make do for the sake of Xiangnan and Yi Hui. It wasn't that Yimu Bai didn't know, and he, on the other hand, was making do with her, because can't demand too much. Yimu Bai quickly finished his bath and felt extremely refreshed. He went to check on Xiao Yi Hui and asked Wen Yuan to rest after a while. Wen Yuan said that she was not tired and wanted to sit for a while. He agreed and then peeled a fruit for her. He cut it into small pieces so that it would not be too cold. When Yuan ate in small bites, he reached out to stroke her hair and suddenly asked, "Does it still hurt?" When Yuan almost choked and looked at him, his expression was unfathomable as he continued to stare at her. Then he pulled her hand and asked again, "When Yuan, does it still hurt?" She shook her head. "It doesn't hurt too much." Then they remained silent. She always felt a little uncomfortable talking about this kind of private matter, but Yi Mubai didn't feel uncomfortable. When Yuan felt uncomfortable because she didn't see him as an intimate relationship in her heart, so she resisted and instinctively rejected him. Yi Mubai's gaze fell on her face for a long time, and he didn't say anything. He just gestured for her to lie down, and he covered her with the quilt. Then, he said in a low voice, "I'm going to see Xiangnan. He will have surgery in 2 days." Chapter 3876. When Yuan suddenly grabbed his hand. "I want to see him too." He pressed her hand under the quilt. His movements were very slow and gentle. His voice was also very gentle. "You need a rest, okay?" When Yuan bit her lip. "Yi Mubai, Xiangnan is my son. Isn't he my son?" His eyes seemed to be able to see through people's hearts. "When Yuan, you forgot that you just gave birth to my child. Lie down and sleep. I'll take care of everything." When Yuan was in a trance. She leaned against the white pillow and looked at him. In the end, he was not willing to leave immediately. He sat there and reached out his hand to gently touch her face. When Yuan's eyes were very hot, there was an indescribable feeling. She didn't want to lose her composure, but at such a moment, she still couldn't bear it. She reached out and pressed his palm against her face. She said as if she was dreaming, "How good would it have been if you hadn't left that day?" Her soft words were like a knife to him. He knew that he had hurt her deeply. That day had left a shadow in her heart. He didn't know when she would be able to forget it. "Let's leave it to time," he thought self-deprecatingly. When Yuan's loss of composure only lasted for half a minute. When she came back to her senses, she looked at him with a somewhat embarrassed gaze. Yi Mubai smiled gently. His voice was even lower, as if he was whispering, "I'm going to see Xiangnan. When Yuan, don't think too much. We'll be fine as long as we continue to be together. Okay?" She lay down. After a while, she gave him a very shallow smile. He was moved for a moment. He leaned over and kissed her lips lightly. He said reluctantly, "I really have to go. I'm going to see Xiangnan." When Yuan closed her eyes, he helped her with the quilt again and walked out. The sound of the door closing was heard. When Yuan opened her eyes, her gaze was a little blank. Then, she turned her head and looked at the small bed not far away. Little Yi Hui was sleeping soundly there. She thought that maybe her decision was not wrong. This was for the best. Yi Mubai went to Xiangnan's place. Xiangnan wanted to see his sister. Yi Mubai reached out and touched his head. "Can you wait until Xiangnan's operation is over?" But Xiangnan insisted. Yi Mubai couldn't understand his son's subtle thoughts. Qin Shin leaned on the side, holding a limited grade bone porcelain cup in his hand. It was the standard of the British royal family. He lightly sipped and chuckled. "Your son is afraid. He won't have a chance in the future." She put down the cup in her hand and walked over. She reached out to grab Xiangnan. Xiangnan's medical skills. Xiangnan's ears were pulled, and his little face was flushed red. Poor little guy, this was the first time he was being teased by a woman, and it was such a powerful woman who was both male and female. For little Xiangnan, this was a huge blow to his worldview. Yi Mubai was furious. "Qin Shun, don't lead my son astray," he told Xiangnan seriously. "Dr. Qin is a female doctor. She's not an uncle, she's an aunt." Xiangnan's little face was still a little red as he said shyly, "Then why does Annie look better in a shirt?" Of course, his father also dressed well, but he was still not as good as Annie Qin. Yi Mubai cursed in his heart. Qin Shun was affecting his son's sense of beauty. He couldn't possibly think that women were good-looking like this. He really wanted to crack open this brat's head right now and warn him that his mother, Wan Yuan, was the type that most men liked. Qin Chen style. Women liked it more. "I want to chat with more like-minded people about new wife number 1. Husband, addicted to pampering. Follow you read literature on WeChat, chatting about life and looking for a bosom friend. Chapter 3877. However, Xiangnan was still young. What if he didn't have this kind of thinking? If he corrected himself too much, he would become like Lan Yu? Yi Mubai regretted it. He shouldn't have invited Qin Shun. Among the people he knew, the number of people who had been taken advantage of by Qin Shun could be counted with 10 fingers. Every incident was either tearful or bloody. Yi Mubai said word by word, because her clothes are more expensive. Although this answer was a bit ridiculous, it was the truth. Qin Shun's clothes were indeed more expensive. It was outrageous that a shirt could cost hundreds of thousands of yuan. Even men like them weren't so particular about it. However, Qin Shun was a doctor and maintained this standard of living. He was simply a black-hearted doctor. He clearly had Lan Yu to support him now, but he wasn't satisfied and became a black-hearted doctor. Look at the cup in his hand. It cost tens of thousands. At this moment, Yi Mubai was completely immersed in the black-hearted doctor mode. He completely forgot that his own life was actually very extravagant. When he answered like this, Xiangnan sneaked a glance at Qin Shun again and didn't say anything. He felt that Annie Qin was quite good like this. She was very pretty. The little Xiangnan's aesthetic had already gone against the heavens and collapsed at this moment. Collapsed. Asking for the size of Yi Mubai's psychological trauma, Qin Shun smiled and said lazily, "Tomorrow's surgery. Don't be late." She blinked again. "Don't worry, Xiangnan. It won't affect your handsomeness at all. Trust me, okay?" She was dressed in a languid and charming manner. Xiangnan was completely intoxicated and couldn't move for a long time. Qin Shun smiled again and came over to flick his forehead. Xiangnan's head was dizzy. It was worship and love. Qin Shun bent down. "Do you like Annie?" "Yes," the little Xiangnan said very honestly. Qin Shun reached out and ruffled his hair, smiled gently, and walked out. The little Xiangnan was still watching in fascination. His father pulled his ear. "Yi Xiangnan, listen carefully. You're not allowed to marry a tomboy in the future. Do you hear me?" Xiangnan looked at his father and asked, "Auntie Qin Shun is very handsome." Yi Mubai was a little mad. "You're a boy. Shouldn't boys like little girls, like Inen?" Xiangnan thought for a moment and scratched his head again. "But I think Annie Qin Shun is also very handsome like this. I like it very much." Xiangnan smiled warmly, a little like Wen Yuan. His eyes seemed to twinkle like little stars when he smiled. Yi Mubai was stunned for a moment, then he clenched his fists. This was what he had always wanted to see in Wen Yuan's eyes. But until now, Wen Yuan had never shown such an expression. But now he saw it in Xiangnan's eyes. Xiangnan was so happy. He felt that he shouldn't deprive him of his mood. He already owed Xiangnan a lot and wanted to make it up to him. He didn't want to preach to his son, nor did he want to tell his son what he should do and what he shouldn't do. He and Wen Yuan shouldn't have become husband and wife now. He thought that was fine as long as Xiangnan was happy. Only when a person liked another person would there be such stars in their eyes. Yi Mubai accompanied Xiangnan for a long time. Su Mo came over later. He handed Xiangnan over to Su Mo and went back to Wen Yuan's ward. In such a big space, it was very quiet. Wen Yuan was still resting, and the little fellow who had just been born was also sleeping peacefully. He leaned over and smelled the scent of milk. He wanted to chat with more like-minded people about new wife number 1, husband addicted to pampering. On WeChat, he followed Yudo literature, talking about life, looking for a confidant. Chapter 3878. Yi Mubai bent down and couldn't help kissing the little fellow. Wen Yuan woke up and opened his eyes, but he didn't move. He just looked at him. "How is Xiangnan?" Yi Mubai let go of little Yi Hui and returned to Wen Yuan's bed to sit down. He didn't say anything. Wen Yuan was a little anxious. Yi Mubai. He seemed to be thinking about something and didn't answer her question. "Wen Yuan, are you going to keep calling me Yi Mubai in the future?" She was a little stunned. She didn't understand why he suddenly said this. He looked at her expression and smiled. "If you want to continue living, you can call me Mubai or Yi Mubai, but I prefer you to call me Mubai." Wen Yuan couldn't hold it in anymore. "Yi Mubai." He smiled again and didn't dare to tease her anymore. Xiangnan is very good, but when Yuan looked at him attentively, Yimu Bai found that she would only be so attentive when it came to his son. She was usually a little absent-minded when it came to him. Thinking of this, he felt a little bitter, but he still forced a smile. I just want to ask you, when Xiangnan grows up, what does your daughter-in-law look like? After he finished asking, Wen Yuan breathed a sigh of relief. Why did you ask this? It's something that will happen many years later. Yimu Bai thought about it. There will always be such a day. Wen Yuan didn't think much about it, and said, as long as Xiangnan likes it. Yimu Bai looked at her and sighed softly. What if it's like Qinshen? Wen Yuan frowned. Why do you ask this? How old is Xiangnan? You're thinking too far. He smiled and said, maybe. He wanted to get up and deal with something, but Wen Yuan suddenly stopped him. Hey, Mu Bai. His heart skipped a beat, and he turned to look at her, smiling faintly. Wen Yuan said with a little hesitation, you've been a little nervous recently. Do you want to find a psychiatrist to relax? He laughed involuntarily. Wen Yuan, what are you thinking about? He took a few steps back and bent down to whisper in her ear, Wen Yuan, even if you want to relax, it should be your body. He pinched her face gently with his fingers and said hoarsely, I've been abstinent for half a year. Wen Yuan was speechless and could only look at him. He chuckled and pressed his good-looking lips against the back of her ear. His voice was even huskier. I'll bear with it a little longer. What he meant was that he wouldn't be able to bear it any longer after a certain period of time. Of course, she would feel it when he touched the sensitive part of her ear. Her body stiffened. However, he didn't do anything to her and quickly let her go. He just smiled at her warmly. Wen Yuan clenched his hands and bit his lips. Yimu Bai went to deal with the company's matters, and then he was busy taking care of Xiao Yi Hui and Wen Yuan. Then he went to Xiangnan's place. Wen Yuan felt that he was a little too much. It's enough to have a nurse to take care of him. You should do your own things and accompany Xiangnan when you're free. Yimu Bai just kissed her and didn't say anything. The next day, Xiangnan had an operation. Yimu Bai stayed by Xiangnan's place almost the whole day. Su Mo would come to accompany Wen Yuan when he beat her. Wen Yuan was worried and always wanted to go and see him. Su Mo comforted him. Dr. Qin said that he's 100% confident. Don't worry. Look, you just gave birth. You need to rest more. After all, it's not a small operation. Wen Yuan hugged Yi Hui and said softly against her face. Fortunately, the operation lasted for 6 hours. Yimu Bai called halfway through and said that everything went smoothly. She wanted to talk about new wife number 1, husband addicted to pampering with more like-minded people. She followed Yudo literature on WeChat. Talk about life and find a confidant. Chapter 3879. His tone was very calm, but Wen Yuan knew that he was also nervous. If he wasn't nervous, he would have come back and said it instead of making a phone call. He wouldn't have stayed outside the operating room for 6 hours. 6 hours later, he called again and said that the operation was a success. Wen Yuan cried. Yimu Bai was stunned for a moment, and then he said in a hoarse but very gentle voice, Why are you crying? You should be happy. Wen Yuan, take care of Yi Hui. I'll be with Xiangnan for the next 2 days. Wen Yuan nodded. Later, she found out that Xiangnan was in the ICU. Yimu Bai couldn't go in, but he stood outside to watch over his son. He had his meals in the corridor, and when he was too sleepy, he slept on the bench for the night. The next night, Wen Yuan couldn't stand it anymore. She wanted to see Xiangnan, so she asked the nurses for the location and asked them to take care of Yi Hui while she went to the ICU. When Wen Yuan stood at the end of the corridor, she saw Yimu Bai. He stood straight outside the glass wall, motionless. Her throat seemed to be blocked, and she walked over slowly. She walked all the way to his side. When he heard her footsteps, he turned his head to look at her and said in a hoarse voice, Why are you here? Wen Yuan stood beside him and looked at her son in the ward. Seeing that his body was full of tubes, she felt a little pain in her heart. Her eyes quickly focused, but she held back her tears. As long as Xiangnan could get better, everything would be worth it. After a long time, she choked and said, I'm worried. She looked up at him. Why didn't you say that Xiangnan is here? I was afraid that you would be worried. He reached out and hugged her, letting Wen Yuan smell the cigarette smell on his body, as well as his unchanged clothes, indigo stubble, and slightly red eyes. Wen Yuan's heart ached, so she didn't avoid his closeness. She just whispered, "I'll stay here. You go take a shower and change your clothes." Yi Mubai was unwilling. "Wen Yuan, you go rest. Stay here and watch over Xiangnan." Yi Mubai. Wen Yuan paused. "You haven't taken a shower for 2 days. Your body almost smells." He tilted his head and stared at her. Wen Yuan pursed his lips and didn't say anything. He just looked at him. Finally, Yi Mubai smiled faintly. "I'm going to wash up. You sit down." He helped her sit down, then took off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders. He went back to take a shower and came back in less than 20 minutes. He took 2 portions of food and ate with her. Wen Yuan looked at him and smiled. This was probably the most embarrassing meal of their lives, and it was because they were parents. Fortunately, Xiangnan's body recovered very quickly. He soon left the ICU and entered the VIP room. Moreover, he was on the same floor as Wen Yuan, so it was very convenient for Yi Mubai to take care of him. Xiangnan stayed in the hospital for a month, and Wen Yuan and Xiao Yihui also stayed for a month. A month later, Yi Mubai brought Xiangnan and Wen Yuan back to the apartment. At this time, it was already early summer, and the weather was a little hot. Xiangnan had basically recovered, but he still had a rest. Xiao Yihui, on the other hand, had gained a lot of flesh. She looked chubby and cute. On the day they came back, the servant specially made a lot of delicious food and gave Xiao Yihui and Xiangnan red packets. They hugged Xiao Yihui lovingly, saying that she looked too much like Wen Yuan. In fact, Wen Yuan felt that Xiao Yihui looked more like Yi Mubai, but she didn't refute it. She just smiled slightly. She wanted to chat with more like-minded people about new wife number 1. Husband addicted to pampering. WeChat followed Yudu literature, talking about life, looking for a bosom friend. Chapter 3880. Wen Yuan. This is our duty as husband and wife. The servant held Xiao Yihui for a while and carefully placed her on the small bed. Then he took out a box and handed it to Wen Yuan. This was sent from B City. It's been many days. Wen Yuan was quite surprised. B City? The people in B City had already sent gifts. How could there be more? She thought it might be from her mother, so she opened it directly. Inside was a box of Eastern pearls, each of which was very big. Although they were single beads, the value of such a box was not low. Moreover, it would take a lot of effort to collect such a box. There was also a card inside, signed by Kong Xiao. Wen Yuan was surprised, yet not surprised at the same time. She picked up one of the beads, looked at it for a moment, then looked at the card. At this moment, Yi Mubai walked out. Wen Yuan, Xiangnan's, the question he wanted to ask was stuck in his throat. He looked at the thing in her hand and the words on the card. He saw it. The atmosphere was a little subtle. After all the unhappiness that had happened between them before was caused by Kong Xiao's appearance. This time, Kong Xiao didn't come personally, but sent a box, the pearl in the palm, with a profound meaning. Wen Yuan heard his voice and closed the box. "What's the matter?" Yi Mubai's eyes were still on her hand. After pausing for a while, she smiled faintly. "Do you know where the little doll Xiangnan hugged when he slept is?" Because she was the one who packed the luggage, he couldn't find it, so he came to ask her, but he didn't expect to see this. It wasn't that he didn't feel anything. He could sense the subtle changes in her. After going through so many things, was her heart still as calm as still water towards Kong Xiao? In his heart, he was not sure, but he knew that if he continued to rudely stop her from seeing Kong Xiao, it would really be over between them. So he endured the discomfort and pretended that nothing had happened. Wen Yuan slowly put the card into the box and handed it to the servant. "Help me put away." Then she went to look for Xiangnan's little doll. Yi Mubai followed behind her. Both children were asleep, so they were very quiet, but the silence made the atmosphere even more subtle. Wen Yuan searched in the suitcase. She squatted for a long time, but couldn't find it. She looked up and wanted to ask him, but Yi Mubai had already reached out and pulled her up and pressed her against the wall. Yi Mubai. She didn't forget that Xiangnan was sleeping. She whispered to him, "What's wrong?" His eyes were burning, as if they were about to burst out. He seemed to be angry and seemed to be filled with a lot of dissatisfaction. In the end, he didn't say anything and just leaned over to kiss her. She thought it would be wild and rough, but he was very restrained and only kissed her for a minute before letting her go. "I," he said. "I and went, he in and went. I." He was angry, and she knew it, but she didn't chase after him to explain. That would be too degrading. After she came back to her senses, she continued to look for Xiangnan's little doll. After a few minutes, she finally found it. She took it out and gently put it next to Xiangnan's pillow. When she was about to pack the rest of the luggage, Yi Mubai came back and pushed her aside. "Go to rest. I'll pack." They had the same habit of not letting servants handle the things in the bedroom. End of this chapter. Chapter 3881. 1 Yuan. This is the duty of husband and wife too. When Yuan looked at him, who was obviously suppressing his anger and trying hard to control it. She smiled faintly and went back to the bedroom to rest. She had only given birth for a month, so she had not fully recovered yet. After a short nap, she found that the sky was already dark when she woke up. She felt a little uncomfortable, so she went to take a shower. When she came back, Yi Hui was awake and wanted to eat. When Yuan picked her up and laid on the bed to feed her. While Yi Hui was eating, Wen Yuan was still a little sleepy, so she closed her eyes. At this time, she only had a bathrobe on, and she looked very relaxed and warm. When Yi Mubai came in, he saw her like this. Wen Yuan seemed to have fallen asleep. Only little Yi Hui was eating and eating with all her might. It was probably because she could not reach the other side after finishing one side. Little Yi Hui's little face turned red, and she was about to cry. A touch of gentleness appeared on Yi Mubai's face. He went over to pick up the little fellow and put her on the other side. At first glance, Yi Hui was a gluttonous baby. These days, he and Wen Yuan were very busy, but Yi Hui didn't miss a single meal. She would cry softly when she was hungry, so she was raised to be white and chubby. She was very likable. Yi Mubai liked her very much. He kissed the little fellow and then looked at the little fellow's mother with a profound gaze. The child's mother was even more likable. His eyes seemed to be on fire, probably because his gaze was too hot. When Yuan woke up, Yi Mubai's voice was very soft. "Why did you fall asleep?" He reached out and gently rubbed her hair, then walked out like a gentleman. When Yuan lowered her head and looked at her messy appearance, she bit her lower lip. She clearly saw Yuan in his eyes just now. Yi Mubai walked out and let out a deep breath. It took him a lot of effort to suppress what he had just seen. He went to the study and smoked a few cigarettes before coming back. When Yuan had already fed Yi Hui and changed into a set of home clothes. "It's time for dinner. Xiangnan has already eaten. You want to watch TV for a while," he said in a low voice. When Yuan nodded, "Okay." She looked at Yi Hui again and went out to have dinner with him. Tonight was especially sumptuous. They hadn't had a meal at home for a long time. It was very quiet and warm. After dinner, Wen Yuan did a set of exercises and accompanied Xiangnan for a while. It was already 10 o'clock when he took care of Yi Hui. She stretched herself, feeling a little tired. Actually, taking care of 2 children was quite tiring for a woman who had just given birth. She took a shower and prepared to sleep. She thought about it and decided to leave a night light on for him. When Yi Mubai came back, he saw Wen Yuan sleeping quietly. She had fallen asleep and was not alert at all. As he thought about it, he took off his coat, threw it on the sofa, and went to the bathroom. 5 minutes later, he came back and stood by the bed. He seemed to be a little hesitant, but in the end, he still pressed his body against hers. Wen Yuan woke up and looked at his husband under the dim light. It was almost late at night, so he didn't need to suppress his desire anymore. He vented it all in this kiss. Wen Yuan was a little dizzy from his kiss, and her consciousness was a little blurred. After a long time, he ended the kiss and began to nibble her neck. She came back to her senses and reached out to push him away. Yi Mubai was a little confused, and then he was displeased. "Wen Yuan, we are husband and wife." His fingers pressed on her lips. "You don't want me to touch you?" Wen Yuan's face turned to the side. After giving birth, we can only have sex for at least 42 days. I've only given birth for a month. Into this chapter. Chapter 3882. When you on. This is a couple's obligation burying his face in her neck. He chuckled and bit her neck. I know. I'll just kiss you, okay? She actually wanted to refuse. It's a bit late. He continued to bite her neck and said in a low voice, It's not 11 yet. As he said that, he suddenly grabbed her hand and let her feel him. When you on turned her face away. Yimu bai, don't be like this. Then what do you want? The smile in his eyes disappeared a little. When you on, you're my wife. Isn't it normal for us to be like this? He didn't want to force her, but he was her husband. He had seen the look on her face when she accepted Kankyo's gift. He had felt jealous, but he had to endure it. Now, she wasn't even willing to give him some normal intimacy. As he thought about it, he became more and more rough and bit the soft flesh behind her ear. When you and I cried out. She tried to move away from him, but he didn't let her. He hooked his arm around her waist and pressed her under his body. His voice was particularly hoarse. When you on, why do you want to escape? Is it because of Kan Xiao? Finally, he couldn't help but say it. When Yuan looked at him, her whole body stiff. After a while, she said softly, I refuse because I'm not in the mood. Yimu bai, if you think that a woman who just gave birth has to sleep with you, even if she can't do it, she has to satisfy you. If you're not willing, then you're just thinking about someone else. You could do whatever you want. She didn't resist anymore and just lay down, but her face was buried in the pillow. She clenched her fist and bit in her mouth, and her nose was also red. Her appearance made men feel tender and protective of the fairer sex, and they were on the same bed at the moment. Seeing that she was really angry, Yi Mubai rolled to the side and looked at her. I don't have to do it. Don't be angry, okay? She still bit her fist and cried silently. He looked at her for a while and was sure that he couldn't coax her anymore, so he pulled her into his arms again. This time, he did not enjoy it himself. Instead, he pressed her down and kissed her from her chin to her neck, all the way down. Wen Yuan was stunned. She wanted to stop him, but he forcefully pinned her to the bed, completely breaking her down. Wen Yuan cried, telling him to stop. She hadn't been treated like this for far too long. She couldn't bear it all. She begged for a long time, but he finally let her go. However, he still held her hand and refused to let her move. He pressed his forehead against hers. Are you happy now? Her face was full of tears, and she was sobbing. He was too familiar with her weakness. If he wanted her to live, she would live. If he wanted her to die, she would die. When Yuan was afraid that he would go crazy, he turned his face away. Let go of me. He didn't let go and made her promise. Tell me that you're willing to do it with me in 12 days. She bit her lip and glared at him. Yimubai, can't you have some depth? There was a smile in his eyes. Aren't we talking about a very deep topic now? She angrily turned her face to the side, and he pressed his face against her shoulder. His voice was a little hoarse. When you on, marriage is your choice. A marriage without sex can't last. My request is not too much, is it? Unless you have feelings for Kong Xiao, even if you treat me. He paused and said bitterly, It's not like before, but you won't refuse this kind of physical need. End of this chapter. Chapter 3883. Wen Yuan. This is the duty of husband and wife for hearing this. When Yuan roughly knew what he was thinking. He knew what she was thinking. He was asking for some basic duty. To put it bluntly, it was the duty between husband and wife, and he wanted her to fulfill it. In fact, when Yuan couldn't refuse him, and she didn't want to refuse him, he was thinking too much. He felt uneasy because of Kankyo's gift. When Yuan turned his face and smiled at him. I didn't say I would refuse. It's just that it's not convenient tonight, and I'm a little tired. Yimubai, you will not give me a little freedom, right? He stared at her, his eyes locked on her, not letting go of her expression. When Yuan thought that he was really like a lie detector at this time. Yimubai must not have realized it. After a long time, his expression finally relaxed, and he smiled faintly. You're right. Women are like men. Sometimes they don't want to do it. He deliberately said it very rudely. Wen Yuan bit her lip, a little speechless. She rolled to the side and lay down, looking at the ceiling. Then she suddenly said, "I had a vasectomy a few days ago." Wen Yuan was surprised. How could a man like this? Didn't it mean that he didn't have the right to be a stud? If he wanted to raise a child outside, wouldn't he be unable to give birth to another child? Yi Mubai misunderstood her silence and reached out to hold her hand. It can be restored in the future, but Wen Yuan, it's enough for us to have 2 children. Wen Yuan glanced at him, a little strange. Did he misunderstand? After that, he didn't do anything to her. He just hugged her to sleep. In the middle of the night, Yi Hui woke up and wanted to change her diaper and eat. Her little mouth was very big. Wen Yuan then remembered that Yi Mubai reached out and pressed her. "I'll go and carry her over. Don't move." Wen Yuan didn't say anything. He quietly walked over and carefully picked up little Yi Hui. He helped her change her diaper and carefully wiped her, but with a hot towel. After he was done, he placed her in Wen Yuan's arms. When Wen Yuan lifted his shirt, he seemed to hesitate. Yi Mubai's breathing became hot. "I'll go check on Xiangnan. You feed her." As he spoke, he walked out. Wen Yuan looked at his back. After making sure that he had left, he lowered his head to feed the night fennel. Little Yi Hui ate with relish. She was a very easy child to take care of. She was well-behaved and obedient. Other than eating and changing her diapers, she spent most of her time sleeping. When she was awake, she would play with her little fingers. Occasionally, she would even smile at people. She was very adorable. Wen Yuan lowered his head and gazed at the side of his little daughter's face. From her forehead to her little nose and mouth, there was not a single part of her that he did not like. She could not help but pinch Xiao Yi Hui's soft and tender cheeks. Xiao Yi Hui only raised her head to look at her before she continued to eat. These days, Wen Yuan's nutrition has been very good. If she can't finish the night fennel, she has to squeeze it out. Otherwise, she will feel uncomfortable. Wen Yuan only ate one side of the night fennel. He lowered his head to look at it and decided to squeeze it out even though it was already late at night. She went to the bathroom. Because it was too embarrassing, she only turned on a small nightlight. She emptied it in front of the mirror. It was a little embarrassing, but it was better than feeling uncomfortable because of the bloating. Yi Mubai went to check on Xiangnan. When he came back, he didn't see Wen Yuan in the bedroom. He thought for a while and walked towards the bathroom. There was only a small light in the bathroom. When he stepped into the bathroom, he saw her lying there with her pajamas open. She was emptying Xiao Yi Hui's granary. Chapter 3884. Wen Yuan. This is the duty of a married couple because the scene was too erotic. His Adam's apple bobbed uncontrollably, and his body tensed up. Wen Yuan turned her head and saw him. She immediately covered her clothes with her hands. "Get out." Not only did Yi Mubai not leave, but he also walked a few steps toward her. He stood behind her and said in a low voice, "Can't you finish the night fennel?" He paused for a moment and continued in a hoarse voice, "Can't you leave it for tomorrow?" Wen Yuan covered her clothes and bit her lips. "I have to squeeze it out. Yi Mubai, can you get out?" He suddenly hugged her slender waist from behind, rested his chin on her shoulder, and looked into her eyes in the mirror. He held her like that for a while, and then kissed her neck. "I'll help you, okay?" Wen Yuan's body trembled, and she wanted to refuse without thinking. "No need, I'll do it myself." But he had already succeeded. How could she resist him when he was so overbearing? Wen Yuan closed her eyes almost at the same time. She couldn't look at everything in the mirror. It was too embarrassing. Although they had had countless affairs between them, they had never been like this before. She had never seduced him after marriage. He had always been the one who took the initiative, and now it was even more so. If he didn't want it, she definitely wouldn't want it. "Are you feeling better?" He held her waist with one hand and waited on her. His voice was even lower than before. Wen Yuan bit his lips and said in a broken voice, "All right, stop it." He chuckled and leaned over to whisper in her ear, "Did I hurt you?" Wen Yuan's eyes were half closed, and his voice was hoarse. "Stop talking. I'm fine." She pushed his hand away and wanted to fix her clothes, but his hand didn't move at all. She tried to push him away, but he held her hand. He was too overbearing. Wen Yuan was about to cry. "You move by, I'm tired," he said gently. "Wen Yuan, open your eyes." She didn't want to. She knew how unbearable she was right now. She wouldn't let him have his way. Yimu Bai chuckled, picked her up, and put her on the sink in front of him. With his back facing the mirror, he leaned over and chuckled. "It's a waste to clean it like this." Wen Yuan cried out in grief. He stretched out his hand and pressed down on Qin Wentian's black head. He didn't expect Qin Wentian to do this. She opened her eyes, but she forgot that she was also in front of a mirror. That scene was simply unbearable. After that, her legs were so weak that she couldn't move at all. She had to lean on him to calm herself down. Fortunately, he didn't continue to do anything out of line. He helped her adjust her clothes. "I'll carry you back to sleep, Wen Yuan pressed on his shoulder. "Let me wash it. If you touch it, you might get infected tomorrow." He chuckled softly, as if he was very happy. In the past month, Wen Yuan had not seen him so happy for a long time. She did not know if what happened just now had pleased him. It was obviously a very bad taste, and it was also a little dirty. "Do almond like this?" She bit her lip and supported him to come down. She also rejected his invitation to shower together and went to take a shower herself. After she was done, she went back to the bedroom and changed into her pajamas. Yimu Bai was still awake. He was leaning against the headboard and scrolling through his phone. Seeing that she was back, he placed his phone on the headboard and patted the spot beside him. "Time to sleep." Wen Yuan walked over slowly and lay down beside him. The moment she closed her eyes, she thought, "That's it. End of this chapter." Chapter 3885. Asked her to get here right now. 2 years later, Yimu Bai brought Wen Yuan and the 2 children back to B City. At this time, his focus had also moved to B City. His Star Entertainment was listed in New York. Now, Yimu Bai had a net worth of hundreds of billions. Of course, he began to shoot commercial films to stimulate investors and stocks. Sometimes, Wen Yuan felt that he had become stinky with money. However, Wen Yuan was also an ordinary person. She could not enjoy the life of wealth brought by money and despise him at the same time. She was basically raised by him as a rich wife. She did not do anything but take care of the children. Occasionally, she would go shopping with Shirley and Su Mo, drink tea, and so on. She did not have many friends because she had just returned to China. On the other hand, Yimu Bai's life was completely different. After returning to China, he became very busy. He had endless social engagements, endless phone calls, and endless women. From time to time, he would appear in the newspapers, challenging her authority as the legitimate wife. Wen Yuan did not know why he did not deal with it. She knew that he had nothing to do with those women because he would come back every night and almost every night. A man who cheated on others would not have such a strong interest in his wife. Life was not bad, and the wounds of the past seemed to have healed. Wen Yuan thought silently as she ironed his shirt and hung it up. He had a lot of social engagements, and in recent years, he had become more and more particular. He would not wear clothes that were not ironed by her. Wen Yuan felt that this was a habit of his. Neither Xiangnan nor Yi Hui had this problem. However, she still did it because she had nothing else to do besides doing housework every day. Xiangnan went to school, and there was a driver to pick him up. There was also a tutor at home. As for Yi Hui, Su Fu had recently taken her over. Su Fu did not have a daughter, so Bai Anan was her toy, and Yi Hui was Bai Anan's toy. Wen Yuan was quite relaxed. She would usually do maintenance, such as yoga, to maintain her figure and appearance. She took good care of herself, but she was becoming more and more conservative in her clothes. After all, she was used to living at home. After finishing her chores, she took a bath and changed into a set of conservative home clothes. She then went downstairs to see the dinner that the servants had prepared. She was quite satisfied and returned to the living room. They were now living in a very large villa. There were 8 suites alone, which was the most luxurious mansion in B City. Living in such a place could be considered as reaching the pinnacle of life, Wen Yuan thought somewhat self-deprecatingly. She dialed Yi Mubai's number. He was in a meeting, but he still answered his wife's call. "Wen Yuan, what's up?" Yi Mubai's voice was very gentle, with some affection. Everyone in Stars Entertainment knew that CEO Yi loved his wife very much. No one dared to have any ideas about CEO Yi in Stars Entertainment, except for some blind little stars who pounced on him. On the one hand, it was also because CEO Yi always kept a distance from others and would not give women a chance to get close to him. CEO Yi would only be so gentle when he answered Madam's call. When Yuan sat on the sofa and asked him softly if he was coming back for dinner tonight. He covered his phone and sent his secretary off. "Do I have any plans tonight?" Secretary Hina immediately said, "There's a cocktail party." He nodded and motioned for them to continue the meeting. He walked out of the conference room and chose an empty aisle. His voice was gentle. "There's a cocktail party tonight, and there's no time for dinner. I'll try to come back early, okay?" He had activities almost every night, and when Yuan was used to it, he just said that he got it and hung up. End of this chapter. Chapter 3886. Ask her to get her ass in here right now. She hung up the phone. Yi Mubai looked at his phone and frowned slightly. She didn't say goodbye and just hung up on him. He let out a long sigh and stood in front of the window at the end of the corridor, looking down. He stood on the 68th floor, as though he was stepping on the entire world. He took out a cigarette from his pocket and lit it up, smoking quietly. All these years, to Yi Mubai, fame, power, status, even a wife and children, he seemed to have lived the life that all men wanted to live. However, he knew that he was not satisfied. The reason why he was not satisfied was because this marriage was becoming more and more boring. He didn't know what Wen Yuan was thinking, but in his heart, he felt that it was boring. Although their married life was still harmonious and maintained a frequency of at least 5 nights a week, there was still something missing. Wen Yuan didn't think there was anything wrong with it. She seemed to be living a comfortable life. He smoked silently and returned to the meeting room after finishing a cigarette. Obviously, everyone felt that CEO Ye's mood wasn't as good as before, so they were all on high alert, afraid that they would be pressed against the floor by CEO Yi. The secretary, Hina, looked at her boss's expression and tucked her tail between her legs. After the meeting, Yi Mubai returned to the office. Hina tried to ask, "CEO Yi, should we cancel the party tonight?" Yi Mubai played with a globe in his hand and said absent-mindedly, "No need. Let's just leave it at that." He paused and suddenly said, "Oh right, how's the preparation for the company's 2nd anniversary?" "The plan is out, CEO Yi. Several departments are doing the final coordination. I think there will be a complete set of plans tomorrow or the day after, and they will give it to CEO Yi." Hina finished speaking and smiled. "I heard that Kong Xiao was invited this time. I like it." Yi Mubai's gaze froze, and he stared at her. "What did you say?" "Kong Xiao was invited." Hina clasped her hands together, her face a little dreamy. "Yes, the design of the PR department is like this. Kong Xiao will play the piano, and the songs are all famous love songs. Then, CEO Yi and his wife will dance on the stage. Just thinking about it is amazing." She didn't notice that Yi Mubai's face had darkened. "Whose idea was it?" he asked. He took another cigarette and lit it. After taking a puff, he looked at his secretary. Hina's hair stood on end under his gaze. She wondered how she had offended CEO Yi. Knowing that he had hit the nail on the head, he immediately pushed the blame away. It was arranged by Manager Su from the Public Relations Department. He said that it was creative and fresh, and the scene would definitely look good. Su Mo? Yi Mubai was basically a refined man. At this moment, he burst out with vulgarities. "Pretty my ass." Secretary, he was stunned. CEO Yi didn't like to flaunt his affection in public, but he didn't have to be so angry, right? Yi Mubai pressed the cigarette, and said coldly, "Where's Su Mo? Call her over and tell her to get her ass in here right now." Secretary's expression was a little speechless. There were tears in her eyes. CEO Yi had never been so rude to her before. She almost burst into tears, but for the sake of survival and a high salary, she still went to the 32nd floor in high heels to find Su Mo. 10 minutes later, Su Mo came over. She was wearing a Chanel suit, and her hair was neatly combed at the back of her head. She looked very capable. End of this chapter. Chapter 3887. Ask her to get in here immediately. She closes the door, walks to the sofa, and sits down. CEO Yi, what's the matter? Yi Mubai looks at her and suddenly throws the document in his hand at her. Suemo avoids it. She picks it up with a good temper and sighs softly. Here it comes again. Once when Yuan is involved, he gets angry and has a bad temper. He is totally different from the gentle and gentle person he used to be. Fortunately, she didn't fall into his trap. Why are you so angry? Menopause will come early. Then she smiles harshly. You will lose your charm. The veins on Yi Mubai's forehead are bulging. Suemo, don't think that you can climb on my head just because you have a good relationship with Wen Yuan. Let me tell you. Tell me what? Are you going to fire me? Suemo smiles coldly. Yes, I am just relying on my good relationship with Wen Yuan. You can fire me if you want. Yi Mubai wants to throw something again. He feels that he has fed her to the dogs all these years. He stands up and looks at her coldly. It was your idea to invite Kong Xiao here. Suemo, you are a traitor. Suemo has changed a lot these years. She used to be a small assistant, but he has given her the public relations job. To be honest, she is very capable, but she is becoming more and more unreasonable. It is simply a provocation. Suemo smiled and said, inviting the most popular Kong Xiao is a traitor. CEO Yi, are you not confident in your own charm? Yi Mubai was provoked. He stood up straight and said, Suemo, I'll deal with you after this matter is over. Suemo stands up and smiles. I won't give CEO Yi this chance. I think Wen Yuan will be very grateful for my arrangement this time. He can meet his old friend. Yi Mubai narrowed his eyes, and Suemo casually walked out. When she walks to the door and holds the doorknob, Yi Mubai suddenly says, Suemo pauses and turns sideways. CEO Yi, is there anything else? Yi Mubai's voice is a bit indifferent. Don't you have your own selfish motives? Maybe Wen Yuan doesn't know, but you can't lie to me or yourself. Also, don't touch my bottom line. Wen Yuan is my wife, and she can only be my wife forever. Suemo smiles. I think so too. CEO Yi, in order to maintain a stable and happy marriage, you have to work hard. She walks out. When she closes the door, there is still a slight change in her expression. It is as if the mask used to protect her has finally been taken off. In the past few years, she had followed Yi Mubai and established Starlight Films. The process could be described as stepping on countless corpses. She had seen the cruelty and darkness clearly, and she had gone through it with Yi Mubai. As for Wen Yuan, she had always been well protected by him. Suemo also felt that a woman like Wen Yuan should stay at home to take care of her husband and children. There was no need for her to know about these things, nor did she have to face them. This was why Wen Yuan rarely showed herself. She was real. She was well protected. However, even if Wen Yuan and Yi Mubai lived together, they were still two parallel lines. Yi Mubai knew this, but he didn't want to change it. As for Wen Yuan, he was holed up in the safe zone and refused to enter Yi Mubai's world. Suemo felt that the couple's breakthrough was Kong Xiao. Only Kong Xiao's appearance could revive the couple's stagnant marriage. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.